My wife and I once owned a small house by the sea, but we moved to the city decades ago. I had not been back to that coast in 36 years while she visited it religiously every single season. The very day we buried her, my family demanded I sell that useless rusted shack immediately. I decided to visit it one last time before signing my life away, but when I pushed open the corroded iron gates, I froze. What I found hiding inside changed my life and destroyed theirs forever. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who underestimated your intelligence. My name is Alton Reynolds. I am 70 years old, a retired mechanical engineer, and what I am about to tell you will change how you look at the people closest to you. The damp earth hit the polished wood of Sylvia's casket with a heavy, hollow thud. It was a sound that finalized 45 years of marriage, 45 years of shared coffee, quiet mornings, and a love that anchored my very existence. The pastor was still murmuring his final prayers under the gray, overcast sky when I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned away from the grave of my beloved wife to see my daughter-in-law Heather adjusting her expensive, oversized sunglasses. She did not offer a comforting hug or a word of solace. Instead, she crossed her arms and sighed loudly, complaining about the humidity ruining her hair. Standing right beside her was my son-in-law Blake, a real estate developer who always wore suits that cost more than my first car. Blake did not even wait for the gravediggers to finish their somber work before he pulled a folded document from his tailored jacket. He thrust a sleek silver pen toward my chest. "Alton," he said, using my first name with a casual disrespect that made my jaw clench. "We need to get this out of the way. That old beach house Sylvia left behind is a massive tax liability. It is nothing but a rusting shack eating up property taxes. My company will take it off your hands right now for a flat $100,000. Just sign the transfer deed and we can all move on." My own son DeAndre stood a few feet away looking at the ground, refusing to meet my eyes, while his wife and brother-in-law ambushed a grieving widower on cemetery grass. I looked at the silver pen hovering inches from my chest and then at Blake's perfectly styled hair. A cold, hard knot formed in the center of my stomach, instantly burning away the heavy fog of my grief. I did not yell. I did not cause a scene to disrespect the solemnity of my wife's resting place. I simply reached out, took the folded paper from his hand, and slid it into the inner pocket of my black morning coat. "I will read it when I am ready," I said, my voice dropping to a low, gravelly register that made Blake step back instinctively. "I need to see the rusty gate one last time before I sell anything." Without waiting for their protests, I turned my back on them and walked toward my car, leaving them standing in the damp grass. The drive back to my city home was suffocatingly quiet. For 40 years, I worked as a senior mechanical engineer at an aerospace manufacturing plant. My entire career was built on identifying structural flaws, calculating pressure points, and understanding exactly when a piece of machinery was going to crack under stress. I applied that same logic to people. For years, I had seen the hairline fractures in my family. I saw DeAndre entitlement growing. I saw Heather shallow greed taking root. And I saw Blake predatory ambition. But Sylvia was the master peacekeeper. She was the gentle mortar that held our fractured foundation together, always making excuses for them, always sending them money behind my back, smoothing over the ugly truths with her boundless grace. Now that she was gone, the structural integrity of this family had collapsed in less than an hour. Arriving at our empty house felt like walking into a museum dedicated to a life that no longer existed. The silence was deafening. I took off my coat and hung it on the rack, moving with mechanical precision just to keep myself from breaking down. I went into my home office, a small room lined with oak bookshelves and filing cabinets where I kept our financial records meticulously organized. I needed to put Sylvia life insurance documents away and gather the courage to face a future without her. But as I approached the heavy iron safe tucked beneath the bottom shelf, my engineering instincts flared. Something was wrong. The dial on the combination lock was slightly misaligned. I am a man of exact habits. I always leave the dial resting perfectly on the 0 mark after locking it. Right now, it was resting on the number 7. My pulse quickened. I dropped to one knee and spun the dial, entering the combination that only Sylvia and I knew. The heavy metal door clicked and swung open with a soft creak. Inside, my meticulously arranged folders were pushed askew. The velvet box holding Sylvia's vintage pearl necklace was overturned, though the pearls were surprisingly still there. They were not looking for jewelry. They were looking for liquid assets. I pulled out my primary ledger and the emergency backup flash drive where I kept digital records of all our banking passwords. The small leather pouch where I kept emergency cash was unzipped and completely empty. My breath hitched in my throat. I pushed myself up off the floor, walked over to my desk and booted up my computer. My hands, which had remained steady while burying my wife, were now shaking with a cold, creeping fury. I logged into my primary retirement checking account, the one I used to pay for Sylvia expensive medical treatments over the past few months. The screen loaded and the number stared back at me like a physical blow. The balance was severely depleted. I clicked on the recent transaction history, and there it was. A massive digital wire transfer had been initiated directly from my account to an external routing number. $15,000 was gone. I looked at the timestamp on the transaction. It was processed at exactly 10:45 in the morning. I stared at the screen as a chilling realization washed over me, freezing the blood in my veins. 10:45 was the exact moment the pastor had been reading Sylvia's eulogy. While I was weeping over my wife's casket, someone in my family was draining my life savings. The betrayal radiated through my chest, cold and precise. I did not waste time calling the police or screaming at the walls. I closed the laptop, grabbed my car keys, and walked out the door. The drive to the coast took 2 hours. For 36 years, I had avoided this highway. Sylvia used to make this drive 4 times a year, packing her bags with a quiet smile, claiming she needed the ocean air for her joints. I always stayed behind, consumed by my engineering contracts and plant schedules, writing off the property as a sentimental burden she refused to let go. Now the asphalt blurred beneath my tires as my mind processed the calculated cruelty of my own family. Someone had accessed my safe, stolen my passwords, and wired $15,000 into the void, all while I buried my wife. As I navigated the final winding dirt road toward the coastal cliffs, I expected to see overgrown weeds and the forgotten ruins of a wooden cabin. Instead, I saw 3 white commercial pickup trucks parked illegally along the shoulder. A group of 5 men wearing hard hats and bright yellow safety vests were marching across the perimeter of the property line. They were driving wooden stakes into the soil and peering through optical leveling transits. Emblazoned on the side of their trucks was the logo for Blake Real Estate Development Firm. He had not even waited for me to sign the transfer deed. He was already surveying the land for demolition. I slammed my brakes, sending up a cloud of gravel, and stepped out of my vehicle. Decades of managing factory floors and hostile union negotiations had taught me exactly how to project authority. I marched directly toward the lead surveyor, a tall man with a clipboard who looked up in surprise. I demanded to know exactly who authorized them to breach private property. The man stammered, claiming his boss Blake had instructed them to prep the site for immediate clearing. I stepped into his personal space, my voice completely devoid of emotion, and informed him that the land belonged to me, the deed was strictly in my name, and if they did not pack up their equipment within 60 seconds, I would have them arrested for criminal trespassing and file a lawsuit against their firm that would bankrupt them. The surveyor took one look at my face and immediately radioed his crew. They scrambled, pulling their wooden stakes from the earth and tossing their heavy equipment into the back of their trucks. Within 3 minutes, the roar of their engines faded down the coastal road, leaving me entirely alone. I turned to face the entrance of the property. A massive iron gate stood before me, heavily oxidized from decades of salty sea air. Vines of thick ivy had crawled up the sides, attempting to swallow the metal whole. I remembered buying this plot of land in 1990. It was a modest, creaky wooden shack, then a foolish romantic purchase we made when DeAndre was just a boy. I hated the maintenance it required, so I stopped coming. I assumed time and the harsh coastal storms had reduced the structure to splinters. I expected to find a collapsed roof, rotting floorboards, and a worthless pile of debris. I took a deep breath, gripped the rusted iron handle, and pushed with all my strength. The heavy hinges groaned loudly, protesting the movement, but the gate slowly gave way. I stepped past the overgrown threshold, brushing aside the thick hanging branches. I prepared myself for the stench of decay and mold. I prepared myself to understand why Blake thought this land was only worth a quick demolition. I walked down the long, winding driveway, the gravel crunching under my shoes. The dense coastal trees blocked the view of the main structure until I rounded the final corner. I braced myself for a pathetic sight, ready to finally put an end to the sentimental anchor my wife had held onto for so long. What I saw stopped me dead in my tracks. There was no rotting wooden shack. The old cabin had been completely eradicated. In its place stood a sprawling, multi-million-dollar compound. It was a massive architectural marvel constructed of reinforced steel-tinted glass and polished concrete. The structure was clearly designed to withstand hurricane-force winds, boasting pristine solar panel arrays across the flat roof and state-of-the-art security cameras mounted at every corner. I walked forward slowly, my mind struggling to process the impossible reality. The massive sliding glass bay doors were completely transparent, revealing the interior of the compound. It was not a home. It was a high-tech, immaculate restoration garage. Inside, lined up perfectly on pristine epoxy floors, were hydraulic lifts supporting an array of classic cars. I recognized a flawlessly restored vintage Corvette, an original Shelby Cobra, and a dismantled Cadillac waiting for parts. Professional-grade tool cabinets, climate control systems, and heavy-duty engine hoists occupied the immaculate space. This was not the hobby of an amateur. This was a professional, heavily funded operation. Millions of dollars had been poured into this facility. My wife had not been coming here to sit in a rocking chair and watch the ocean. Sylvia had been running a massive secret enterprise entirely off the grid, hiding a fortune from the very family that thought she was just a fragile old woman. The scale of the deceit was staggering, but unlike the theft from my safe, this secret felt powerful. I approached the heavy glass bay doors, completely mesmerized by the sheer magnitude of the operation. I reached out to touch the glass, half expecting it to be a mirage. Before my hand could make contact with the glass, the loud metallic clack of a pump-action shotgun echoing through the courtyard made me freeze. I turned slowly toward the side of the garage. Stepping out from the deep shadow of a restored 1969 Mustang was a young man. He was tall, dressed in grease-stained mechanic overalls, holding a heavy shotgun. He did not aim it at my chest, keeping the barrel safely pointed at the concrete, but his stance was strictly defensive. I stared at his face, and my breath caught in my throat. He had my eyes. He had the exact same jawline my son DeAndre had at 18 years old. The young man scrutinized my face for a long, tense moment. He slowly lowered the weapon, let out a deep sigh, and spoke. "You must be Grandpa Alton." The word hung in the salty coastal air. Grandpa. I stared at the young man standing before me as he safely lowered his weapon. My mind raced through decades of family history, searching for a missing piece that matched his face. 15 years ago, my son DeAndre came to my study looking pale and frantic. He confessed that his brief college relationship had resulted in a pregnancy. A week later, he sat in our living room and told Sylvia and me that the girl had taken a massive payout from Heather wealthy parents to quietly terminate the pregnancy and disappear from our lives forever. DeAndre and Heather then proceeded to build their immaculate high society image, completely unburdened by the responsibilities of a child. Now, looking at the grease-stained hands and the unmistakable Reynolds jawline of the boy in front of me, I realized the horrifying extent of my son's deception. The young woman had not ended the pregnancy. DeAndre and Heather had simply discarded their own flesh and blood to protect their pristine social climbing narrative. And Sylvia, my sweet quiet, Sylvia had taken the boy in. She raised him in secret, far away from the toxic ambition of our family. "I am Tevin," the young man said, his voice steady but laced with a heavy sorrow. "Grandma told me you would come eventually. She said if Blake or my father showed up first, I should lock the iron gates and call the police. But she said if Alton Reynolds arrived, I should show him the books." I stood paralyzed by the weight of my wife, double life. The woman I shared a bed with for 45 years had shielded a grandson I never knew existed. I gave Tevin a curt nod and stepped forward. "Show me everything," I commanded. Tevin gestured for me to follow him through the massive glass bay doors. The interior of the garage was perfectly climate-controlled, smelling of motor oil, polished metal, and expensive leather. We bypassed the restored classic cars and entered a small glass-walled office at the back of the facility. Tevin unlocked a heavy steel filing cabinet and pulled out 3 thick leather-bound ledgers, placing them firmly on the drafting table. I opened the first ledger. The columns of numbers, property coordinates, and dates were written in Sylvia unmistakable, elegant cursive. As I scanned the pages, the true magnitude of my wife's brilliance unfolded before my eyes. Sylvia had not just been coming to the coast to escape the city and raise an abandoned child. She had been building an absolute empire. Using a highly sophisticated series of blind trusts and proxy shell companies, Sylvia had systematically purchased the undeveloped coastal property surrounding our original modest plot. Over 36 years, she acquired parcel after parcel until she completely owned the 50 acres encompassing this entire premium stretch of the coastline. Tevin watched me process the documents with quiet respect. "Grandma knew my father and Heather would eventually try to strip you of everything you owned," he explained softly. She knew Blake was a predatory developer constantly looking for prime real estate to exploit for his own gain, so she made sure this land was legally untouchable. She funded this restoration business to teach me a trade and ensure the property taxes were always paid in full. But the real value is the earth beneath our feet. This entire 50-acre coastal compound was recently appraised at $30 million. $30 million. I traced my finger over the official county appraisal documents safely secured in the ledger. My son and his wife had treated Sylvia like a naive, fragile old woman who constantly needed their guidance. They mocked her seasonal coastal trips as the useless eccentricities of a decaying mind. Meanwhile, she had outsmarted all of them, amassing a staggering fortune strictly to ensure her discarded grandson would never have to rely on the people who threw him away like garbage. The $15,000 they shamelessly stole from my safe this morning was absolute pocket change compared to the financial fortress Sylvia had quietly built right under their arrogant noses. Everything instantly clicked into place. The ongoing narrative of the rotting, worthless beach shack was a deliberate, masterful smokescreen. Sylvia had intentionally fed that exact lie to DeAndre, Heather, and Blake for decades. She complained constantly about the rust, the leaking roof, and the terrible property taxes precisely to keep their greedy hands away from the coast. She knew that if Blake thought the land was a toxic, decaying asset, he would never bother making the 2-hour drive to inspect the property himself. The deception was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, turning their own arrogant assumptions into a protective shield for Tevin and the $30 million estate. But the shield was currently failing. Tevin turned away from the heavy ledgers and walked over to a large industrial workbench. He grabbed a thick, rolled-up tube of glossy paper and brought it to the desk. He unrolled it, pinning the corners down with heavy steel wrenches. It was a highly detailed commercial architectural blueprint. "I found this crumpled near the front gate an hour before you arrived," Tevin said, his jaw tightening with anger. "One of those surveyors must have dropped it in a panic when you chased them off the property." I leaned over the drafting table, examining the schematic. The blueprint did not show a classic car restoration garage. It depicted a sprawling luxury resort complete with a massive hotel complex, commercial retail spaces, and a private yacht marina. The project overlay perfectly matched the exact topographical coordinates of our 50 acres. Tevin traced his grease-stained finger over the bold red lines cutting across the surveyor map. He looked up at me with a grim, determined expression. "Blake is not just planning to survey the area, Grandpa. He already sold this entire 50-acre block to a consortium of foreign developers last week." I stared at him, my mind calculating the sheer illegality of the claim. "He cannot sell land he does not own," I stated firmly. "The deed has always been strictly in Sylvia's name." "He did not use his name," Tevin replied, pulling a crumbled photocopy from beneath the blueprint. "Blake is bringing bulldozers tomorrow morning at dawn to tear this entire compound to the ground. He authorized the immediate demolition and the foreign land transfer using a forged signature from Grandma." The sharp, piercing ring of my cell phone shattered the quiet tension inside the garage. I pulled the device from my pocket and stared at the caller ID. Kendra, my daughter. She was the one child I foolishly thought might have escaped the toxic rot of Blake influence. I pressed the answer button and held the phone to my ear. She did not say hello. She did not ask how I was coping with the funeral. Instead, she launched immediately into a hysterical sobbing performance. Her voice was shrill and frantic as she claimed Blake had made a terrible, catastrophic mistake. She spun a wild story about how Blake borrowed a massive sum of money from violent, unforgiving loan sharks to finance his new development firm. She claimed these dangerous men were actively threatening their family. She wept into the receiver, swearing that these thugs were going to take her home and hurt her if the debt was not settled by tonight. She begged me to sign the coastal transfer deed today, insisting it was the absolute only way to liquidate assets and save her life. She played the terrified, vulnerable daughter, perfectly deliberately weaponizing my paternal instinct. But standing next to Tevin and looking directly at the forged blueprint, I saw right through her manufactured tears. Blake did not owe dangerous loan sharks any money. Blake had stolen millions from foreign investors and desperately needed my land to cover his massive fraud. Kendra was not a victim. She was a willing, active accomplice in his criminal scheme. I did not confront her. I did not unleash the fury boiling in my veins or mention the $30 million fortress I was currently standing inside. Instead, I deployed the exact weapon they expected from a grieving 70-year-old widower. I played the helpless, senile fool. I let my voice waver and crack. I stammered heavily, asking her to slow down, pretending that my aging mind simply could not process the extreme urgency of her demands. I told her my chest hurt and that I was completely overwhelmed by the trauma of burying Sylvia just a few hours ago. I muttered aimlessly about needing my reading glasses and not knowing where I placed the documents Blake handed me at the cemetery. Kendra sighed loudly. Her fake sobbing instantly paused, revealing a sharp, irritated impatience that she could not completely hide. She snapped at me, speaking slowly and loudly as if she were addressing a deaf toddler. She ordered me to stop crying, find the paper, and sign it immediately. I pushed the pathetic performance even further. I apologized profusely, my voice trembling with manufactured anxiety and confusion. I assured her I wanted to help save her and Blake, but I claimed I was far too exhausted and disoriented to drive anywhere safely today. I told her I would bring the signed deed directly to Blake corporate office first thing tomorrow morning. I promised her with a shaky voice that everything would be resolved by dawn. The relief in her voice was palpable, masking her underlying contempt for my supposed weakness. She agreed, warning me not to be a minute late, and hung up without even saying I love you. The trap was perfectly set. I had just bought us 24 crucial hours. I lowered the phone and looked at Tevin, my newly discovered grandson. I told him to lock the compound down tight tonight. I ordered him to activate every single security measure Sylvia had installed and ensure no one got in or out. I promised him I would handle Blake tomorrow. I left the coastal property and drove back to the city as the sun began to sink below the horizon. My mind operated with the icy, methodical precision of a wartime general preparing for a siege. The heavy grief over losing my wife was now locked away in a steel vault in my mind, replaced entirely by a singular, relentless drive to dismantle the predators who had invaded my family. I pulled into my driveway and entered the silent, dark house. I bypassed the kitchen and headed straight for my home office. I needed to gather all the authentic deeds, the original ledgers, and Sylvia hidden financial instructions to hand over to my legal counsel tomorrow morning. I pulled a heavy leather satchel from the hall closet and carried it to my desk. I systematically emptied the contents of the iron safe, verifying that the actual property deeds were secure and untouched by whoever stole the $15,000 earlier today. I stacked the thick manila folders, my tax records, and the remaining emergency cash into the bag. I knew I needed to leave this house tonight and move to a highly secure location where DeAndre and Heather could not ambush me with their fake concern or more forged documents. I turned toward the heavy oak bookshelf to grab my thick engineering reference manual where I hide my secondary safe key. As my hand reached for the thick leather-bound book, a tiny, unnatural reflection caught my eye in the dim room. Nestled discreetly between the mahogany bookends sat a decorative ceramic vase that Heather had gifted Sylvia 2 Christmases ago. I leaned in closer, holding my breath. Buried deep within the arrangement of artificial silk flowers, a minuscule red light blinked with rhythmic, precise silence. It was a high-definition hidden surveillance camera. My daughter-in-law did not just steal money from my safe while I was at the cemetery. She had bugged my personal sanctuary to monitor my every move. I did not flinch. I did not look directly at the lens. I slowly grabbed the book, turned my back to the vase, and smiled in the dark. I kept my back to the hidden camera in the vase and slowly lowered my hand. I slid my smartphone from my slacks, navigated to the voice memo application by pure muscle memory, and hit record. I slipped the device securely into my breast pocket, just as the heavy brass tumblers of my front door clicked loudly. DeAndre and Heather had not knocked. They simply used their spare key, marching into my home as if they had already seized the deed. I stepped out of my office and stood in the hallway, letting the shadows mask my face. Heather was carrying a designer tote bag, looking entirely too smug for a woman who just buried her mother-in-law. DeAndre walked closely beside her, avoiding my gaze once again. Standing directly behind them was a tall, excessively groomed man in a sharp gray suit. He carried a slim leather briefcase and wore a polished smile that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. DeAndre cleared his throat and announced that they had brought a specialist to check on my health after the overwhelming trauma of the funeral. He claimed this man was a renowned physician here to conduct a simple, spontaneous wellness check to ensure I was coping with Sylvia passing. The sheer audacity of bringing a stranger into my sanctuary at this hour was staggering. They thought they could corner me in my own hallway and bully me into a medical evaluation to build their malicious legal case. They wanted to prove I was mentally unfit to handle my own massive estate. I looked at the slick man in the suit, then at my treacherous son, and I knew exactly what role I needed to play to secure my victory. I let my shoulders slump forward, instantly shedding the rigid, authoritative posture that decades of engineering had drilled into my spine. I allowed my hands to tremble visibly, clasping them together in front of my chest, as if I were struggling to keep myself physically steady. I looked around the room with widened, panicked eyes, darting my gaze between DeAndre and the stranger in the suit. I forced my voice to crack and stammer, asking them what day it was and why there were so many people in my house so late at night. Heather exchanged a triumphant, malicious glance with the man in the suit. She stepped forward, speaking in that sickeningly sweet, condescending tone predators reserve for the helpless. She patted my shoulder and told me I was just confused. The man introduced himself as Dr. Eris. He opened his briefcase, pulled out a notepad, and began asking me incredibly leading, manipulative questions. He asked if I remembered where I had placed important legal documents earlier today. He asked if I often forgot to lock my doors or if I found myself wandering the dark house looking for Sylvia. I leaned into the performance with absolute precision. I rubbed my temples and mumbled that Sylvia was just in the kitchen a moment ago baking bread. I told them I could not find my reading glasses and that my head felt full of thick, heavy fog. I watched DeAndre shift his weight uncomfortably. He was watching his father supposedly lose his mind, and instead of showing genuine grief, his face only registered cold, impatient relief. Dr. Eris held up 3 fingers and asked me to count backward from 10. I intentionally fumbled the numbers, skipping digits and breathing heavily, acting as if the mental exertion was physically exhausting. I gripped the edge of the hallway table for support, letting a small, pathetic whimper escape my throat. I begged DeAndre to tell me what was happening to my brain. My son patted my back stiffly, promising me they were just trying to get me the help I desperately needed. Every single word of their rehearsed manipulation was being perfectly captured by the recording device tucked neatly in my pocket. They thought they were building an ironclad medical profile to strip me of my rights. They were actually handing me federal evidence of conspiracy and elder abuse on a silver platter. Dr. Eris closed his notepad with a crisp, authoritative snap. He turned to Heather and DeAndre with a practiced expression of deep sympathy. He stated that my symptoms were presenting as textbook advanced cognitive decline. He claimed the trauma of losing my wife had aggressively accelerated a pre-existing degenerative condition, leaving me completely incapable of managing my own financial or legal affairs. The sheer speed of his diagnosis was entirely absurd. No legitimate medical professional would declare a patient mentally incompetent after a 5-minute conversation in a hallway without a single brain scan or blood test. But this man was not a doctor. He was a hired mercenary holding a pen. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick official document. It was a medical certificate of incapacity, completely filled out and already stamped with a notary seal. He had brought the final paperwork with him before even speaking a single word to me. He handed the document directly to Heather, not DeAndre. He told her this certificate would give them the immediate legal leverage they needed to assume emergency guardianship over my estate by tomorrow morning. Heather snatched the paper eagerly, her eyes gleaming with undisguised greed. She thanked him profusely, claiming it was a tragic situation, but absolutely necessary for my own protection. I stood there staring vacantly at the floor, maintaining my facade of a broken, senile old man, while my mind processed the absolute finality of their betrayal. DeAndre guided me toward the living room couch, telling me to sit down and rest my tired mind. I shuffled away obediently, but kept my ears sharply attuned to the entryway. As Heather walked Dr. Eris toward the front door, the slick, professional demeanor of the man instantly vanished. He grabbed Heather by the elbow, pulling her close. His voice dropped to a harsh, demanding whisper that the microphone in my pocket easily picked up. He told her the paperwork was flawless, but he expected the remaining $5,000 of his $10,000 fee transferred by midnight. He explicitly reminded her that the first $5,000 she paid him this morning from the funeral cash was just the deposit. Heather hissed back, promising the wire would clear soon. My stolen retirement money had paid for my own fake medical execution. The front door clicked shut. I waited exactly 3 minutes to ensure DeAndre and Heather had driven away before I pulled the recording device from my pocket and securely saved the audio file. I did not sleep that night. At precisely 6 in the morning, I drove to a sleek glass and steel building in the heart of the financial district. I took the private elevator to the top floor and walked into the immaculate office of Oliver Stanton. Oliver was a ruthless, high-priced estate attorney who operated with the cold precision of a striking shark. He was the man Sylvia had secretly retained for decades to protect her hidden empire. Oliver did not offer me coffee or empty platitudes about my recent widowhood. He slid a thick gray folder across his massive mahogany desk before I even sat down. He looked at me with sharp, intelligent eyes and informed me that we had a critical timeline breach. My son-in-law, Blake, had not just sold the coastal land to foreign developers using forged signatures. He had aggressively leveraged his corrupt connections at the city planning office to file an expedited emergency demolition permit at midnight. Blake falsely claimed the coastal structures were a severe biohazard and an imminent danger to public safety, effectively bypassing the standard municipal review periods. Oliver tapped the gray folder and stated that the permit was currently sitting on a corrupt magistrate's desk, awaiting a rubber stamp signature that would legally authorize Blake to flatten the entire 50-acre compound by the end of the day, erasing my grandson's livelihood and burying their fraud under a pile of concrete rubble. I did not display a fraction of the panic Blake was banking on. I sat in the leather chair opposite Oliver and simply asked for a pen. Oliver pulled a stack of heavily notarized, watermarked documents from the folder and spread them across the desk. This was Sylvia's masterstroke. My wife had anticipated this exact predatory maneuver for years. She knew that the moment she passed, the vultures in our family would circle the estate armed with fake medical evaluations and forged deeds to strip me of everything. She had spent the last 5 years quietly setting up an impenetrable legal fortress. It was a completely irrevocable blind trust. Oliver explained the mechanics of the trap as he handed me the first document. Sylvia had already transferred the titles of the 50 coastal acres into the trust before she died. All she needed was my countersignature as the surviving spouse to activate the final lock, officially moving the property out of the public domain and shielding it entirely from probate court or any fake guardianship claims DeAndre might attempt. I signed the first page, my signature firm and unwavering. Oliver slid the next document forward. This one outlined the ultimate beneficiary. We were legally transferring total unassailable ownership of the entire $30 million estate directly to Tevin. Sylvia had hidden her abandoned grandson away from the poison of his father, giving him the tools to rebuild classic cars. But her final act of love was giving him the earth beneath his feet to ensure he would never be discarded again. I signed the transfer rights sealing Tevin's future and simultaneously setting a financial landmine for my son-in-law. Blake's fraudulent sale to the foreign billionaires was now anchored to a piece of land that he had absolutely zero legal claim to. He had sold a phantom property, and the moment those billionaires realized they had wired millions to a fraudster, Blake would face severe federal prison time. I placed the silver pen back on the mahogany desk, feeling the immense weight of Sylvia's strategic foresight. She had armed me with the exact legal weaponry I needed to annihilate them. The trap was armed, funded, and fully operational. Oliver meticulously checked each signature, ensuring that every initial was perfectly aligned with state law. He nodded, acknowledging that Blake's forged deed was now nothing more than worthless scrap paper. Sylvia had always been a step ahead of their boundless greed, planning her counterattack from the shadows of her quiet coastal trips. Now I was simply executing her brilliant final will. Oliver immediately gathered the signed documents and placed them into a secure digital scanner on the edge of his desk. Within seconds, the encrypted files were transmitted directly to the Supreme Court Registry and the Federal Property Database. He looked at his monitor, watched the progress bar load, and confirmed the transaction was officially verified. The blind trust was legally activated. An impenetrable shield now surrounded the coastal property, rendering any forged deeds, fake medical certificates, or emergency demolition permits completely useless in a court of law. I stood up, adjusting my suit coat, ready to drive back to the coast and deliver the news to Tevin that his home was permanently secure. But before my hand could even reach the brass doorknob, the harsh metallic chime of Oliver's private mobile phone shattered the quiet authority of the office. Oliver glanced at the illuminated screen, and his professional composure instantly vanished, replaced by a grim tension. He typed rapidly on his keyboard, pulling up a live feed from the county dispatch system he monitored for high-stakes property disputes. He turned his monitor toward me, his jaw clenched tight. The corrupt magistrate had not waited for the morning review session to stamp Blake's paperwork as we initially calculated. A massive bribe must have changed hands in the middle of the dark night. The emergency demolition permit had been illegally approved and pushed through the municipal system a full 2 hours ago. Blake now possessed a weaponized piece of paper that gave him immediate, unchecked authority to deploy heavy machinery. The legal shield we just built would hold up in front of a judge, but it meant absolutely nothing to a rogue demolition crew armed with a municipal mandate to destroy. I stared at the flashing red notification on the screen, feeling my pulse quicken. Blake did not even wait for the ink on the corrupt permit to dry. He was not giving us the luxury of a legal standoff in a civilized courtroom. Oliver's phone chimed again, this time with a text message containing a photograph sent from a private security contact stationed near the coast. The image made my blood run cold. Lined up aggressively along the narrow dirt road, their heavy diesel engines smoking in the crisp morning air, were three massive industrial bulldozers. Standing on the reinforced hood of the lead machine, holding a sledgehammer and shouting orders at a reckless demolition crew, was Blake. He was already at the rusted iron gates, ready to tear my grandson's sanctuary to the ground. I did not wait for Oliver Stanton to finish his sentence or offer a strategy. I sprinted out of the mahogany office, took the private elevator down to the parking garage, and pushed my vehicle to its absolute mechanical limits down the winding coastal highway. I knew the exact topographical layout of the coastal property, including a hidden pedestrian access point Sylvia had built into the dense eastern ridge for our grandson Tevin to slip in and out undetected. When I arrived at the coast, the deafening guttural roar of industrial diesel engines violently shook the salty morning air. Three massive yellow bulldozers were lined up nose to tail on the narrow gravel road. Blake was standing proudly on the reinforced steel treads of the lead machine, waving his arms and screaming at his foreman to smash through the rusted iron gate and flatten everything in their path. I bypassed the main road, entirely slipping silently through the thick coastal brush along the eastern ridge. Tevin was inside the compound, gripping his heavy shotgun behind the reinforced glass bay doors, but I had explicitly ordered him over a secure text message to stay completely out of sight. This was my battle to fight. I walked right out of the tree line and stepped into the center of the driveway, completely ignoring the massive steel blades bearing down on the property line. I unfolded a simple aluminum lawn chair I had grabbed from the trunk of my car, placed it directly in the path of the lead bulldozer, and sat down. I unscrewed the cap of my steel thermos and poured a cup of black coffee. The driver of the lead machine panicked and slammed on the heavy brakes, sending a violent screech of locked treads echoing through the trees. The massive steel blade stopped exactly 6 feet from my knees. Blake nearly lost his balance on the hood of the machine. He looked down through the thick cloud of diesel exhaust, his face shifting from aggressive arrogance to absolute shock as he recognized the man sitting calmly in the dirt. Blake jumped down from the heavy machinery, his expensive leather boots sinking deeply into the damp coastal mud. He stormed toward me, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He began hurling insults, his voice cracking with panicked desperation. He called me a senile, demented old fool who had wandered out of his city home and was now illegally holding up millions of dollars of municipal progress. He waved a crumpled piece of paper in my face, aggressively boasting that it was a city-approved emergency demolition permit that gave him total authority over the land. He shouted that the structures behind the rusted gate were condemned biohazards, and he had the legal mandate to erase them from the map right now. He told me I was completely out of my mind, and that my grief over Sylvia had finally shattered my fragile, aging brain. I did not blink. I did not flinch at his loud, aggressive posturing. I simply brought the thermos cup to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. The hot liquid warmed my throat, contrasting sharply with the icy, calculated restraint I maintained. I knew exactly why Blake was screaming so frantically. His foreign investors were waiting for confirmation that the land was cleared. His entire fraudulent empire relied on this specific 50-acre plot being reduced to dirt by noon. If the bulldozer stopped, his multi-million-dollar scam would collapse instantly, and the ruthless people he owed money to would come looking for his head. He desperately needed me to be a confused, easily intimidated old man. He needed me to cower, apologize, and shuffle away in fear. Instead, I sat completely rigid, a silent barricade of engineering discipline and paternal defiance. I stared straight through his tailored suit and his manicured facade, looking at the pathetic, desperate thief hiding underneath. My absolute silence infuriated him more than any shouted threat ever could. The construction crew began to murmur among themselves, shifting uncomfortably in their bright yellow safety vests. They were hired to demolish abandoned shacks, not to murder a well-dressed 70-year-old man drinking coffee in the driveway. The foreman yelled to Blake, stating firmly that they could not move the heavy machines forward until the pedestrian was safely cleared from the active demolition zone. The delay was paralyzing Blake's carefully orchestrated timeline, and the intense pressure was visibly fracturing his sanity. The sudden realization that his hired crew was refusing to crush me sent Blake into a complete frenzy. He realized my silence was not confusion, but a deliberate mocking blockade designed to break him. He marched directly up to my lawn chair, invading my personal space, his breath smelling of stale mints and pure panic. He reached down, grabbed the lapels of my dark suit coat with both hands, and violently yanked me forward. The dark coffee in my cup spilled over the rim, staining the dirt between my shoes, but I kept my feet planted firmly on the ground. He leaned in his face inches from mine, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He threatened to drag my decrepit, useless body off the property himself if I did not stand up and walk away immediately. He hissed that I was ruining his life, that I had no idea what was at stake, and that he would happily throw me into the freezing ocean to secure his investment. I did not break eye contact. I did not raise a hand to push him away or defend myself. I let him grip my collar, allowing the entire construction crew to clearly witness a wealthy developer physically assaulting a senior citizen in broad daylight. The foreman shouted a loud warning, telling Blake to let me go before things escalated into a severe assault charge. Blake gritted his teeth, his hands shaking violently against my chest, but the heavy presence of 10 witnesses forced him to reconsider his violent impulse. He shoved me back into the aluminum chair with a disgusted sneer and stepped away, running his hands through his perfectly styled hair in a frantic motion. He realized he could not physically remove me without risking an immediate arrest, so he decided to weaponize the very municipal system he had already bribed. He pulled a sleek smartphone from his jacket pocket and aggressively dialed 911. He turned his back to me, speaking loudly and smugly into the receiver so the entire construction crew could hear his narrative. He told the emergency dispatcher that a severely demented, confused old man had wandered onto a legally sanctioned, highly dangerous demolition site and was aggressively trespassing. He demanded that the police arrive immediately with a medical transport unit to physically remove a mentally unstable individual who was a severe danger to himself. He smiled at me over his shoulder, entirely confident he had just secured my permanent ticket to a locked psychiatric ward. The distant wail of sirens cut through the heavy coastal air, growing louder until 2 county sheriff cruisers swerved onto the dirt road. Their tires kicked up a thick cloud of dust as they parked aggressively behind the line of bulldozers. Before the officers had even fully exited their vehicles, Blake was already marching toward them, waving his arms and projecting the frantic energy of an innocent victim under siege. He practically sprinted to the lead officer, a burly sergeant with a severe expression, and shoved a crumpled stack of papers directly into the man's chest. Blake began shouting his fabricated narrative with practiced desperation. He pointed his manicured finger at me, claiming I was a severely demented trespasser who had wandered away from a nursing home and was now physically obstructing a legal multi-million-dollar commercial demolition project. He tapped the papers aggressively, insisting they contained a state-certified emergency demolition permit and a verified transfer deed signed by my late wife. He demanded that the officers physically remove me from the premises, strap me into a medical transport unit, and arrest me for criminal interference. The sergeant took the papers, adjusting his duty belt, and cast a long, scrutinizing look at me. I remained completely motionless in my aluminum lawn chair, my hands resting calmly on my knees, projecting the absolute stability of a man who was entirely in control of his faculties. The officer approached me, slowly resting his hand near his radio, preparing to deal with a confused, erratic senior citizen. He asked me for my name and my reason for blocking heavy machinery. I did not raise my voice. I looked the sergeant directly in the eyes and informed him that I was the rightful owner of this land, and the documents in his hand were fraudulent. Before the sergeant could ask for my identification or process my claim, the sleek, aggressive grille of a black luxury sedan glided smoothly onto the gravel driveway. The vehicle parked perfectly parallel to the police cruisers, effectively boxing in the lead bulldozer. The heavy driver's side door opened and Oliver Stanton stepped out into the damp morning air. He wore an immaculate, razor-sharp navy suit, carrying a thick leather briefcase with the kind of absolute authority that immediately commands a room. He bypassed Blake entirely, walking straight toward the police officers. Oliver introduced himself in a crisp, resonant voice as the senior legal counsel representing the Sylvia Reynolds estate. He did not yell or gesture wildly like my son-in-law. He operated with the lethal, quiet precision of a tactical strike. Oliver opened his briefcase and handed the sergeant a heavy stack of documents stamped with glowing raised federal notary seals. Oliver explained systematically that the transfer deed Blake had just provided was a blatant, amateurish forgery. He directed the sergeant's attention to the dates, the municipal registry codes, and the highly specific language of the estate trust. He presented the irrevocable blind trust documents that Sylvia and I had formally established, proving beyond any shadow of a legal doubt that the 50 acres of coastal property had been permanently locked into an untouchable trust before my wife even passed away. Oliver articulated that because the land was completely shielded by the trust, Sylvia possessed absolutely no legal capacity to sign a transfer deed to Blake or his foreign investors, rendering his crumpled piece of paper completely void. He then produced the time-stamped federal activation receipts we had finalized just hours ago in his office, explicitly naming my grandson Tevin as the sole protected beneficiary. Blake's face drained of all color, transforming into a sickly, pale mask of absolute horror. He tried to interrupt, stammering and sputtering about his municipal contacts and his emergency demolition permit. Oliver turned to Blake with a stare so cold it could freeze the ocean behind us. He informed Blake and the listening officers that submitting a forged deed to a federal land registry and bribing a city magistrate to expedite an illegal demolition permit constituted severe felony fraud. Oliver advised the sergeant that my presence in the lawn chair was not a medical emergency or a criminal trespass, but a lawful property owner actively defending his estate against an ongoing criminal conspiracy. The sergeant compared the impeccable federal watermarks on Oliver's documents against the cheap, flimsy photocopies Blake had provided. The legal hierarchy was instantly and undeniably established. The sergeant handed Blake's fake documents back to him with a look of profound professional disgust. He unclipped his radio and signaled to his partner, effectively treating my son-in-law as a hostile threat rather than a victim. The officer turned his broad shoulders toward the construction foreman, who was still standing nervously near the lead bulldozer. In a booming, authoritative voice that echoed across the entire coastal compound, the sergeant ordered the demolition crew to immediately kill their engines and vacate the premises. He warned the foreman that if a single tread moved another inch onto my property, every man in a yellow vest would be arrested and charged with criminal destruction of private property. The heavy guttural rumble of the diesel engines was instantly silenced one by one. The sudden quiet that fell over the dirt road was absolute and humiliating. The construction workers quickly scrambled into their pickup trucks, refusing to make eye contact with Blake. They recognized a sinking ship and abandoned him without a second thought. Blake stood alone in the mud, surrounded by the silent, towering machines he had rented to destroy my family legacy. His immaculate suit was stained with dirt, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. The police officers ordered him to step away from the property line and advised him that he was incredibly lucky we were not pressing immediate trespassing charges on the spot. Blake was completely stripped of his power, his arrogance, and his leverage in front of the very men he had hired to enforce his will. He had tried to treat me like garbage, and I had legally crushed him without ever raising my voice or leaving my chair. Humiliated and entirely defeated, Blake stumbled backward toward his vehicle, his hands shaking violently. The police officers watched him closely, ensuring he retreated down the coastal highway. I remained in my chair, taking one final victorious sip of my coffee. As Blake threw himself into the driver's seat of his luxury SUV, he aggressively snatched his mobile phone from the dashboard. Through the quiet morning air, I could easily hear his frantic, venomous voice echoing from the open car window. He dialed my son. DeAndre. He hissed into the receiver, his tone dripping with pure malice. The old man is not confused. He is playing us, and he just legally blocked the entire demolition. We are completely out of time and out of money. Trigger plan B right now. Get the paperwork and the pills. Have him permanently committed to the psych ward tonight. The digital clock on my bedside table flipped to exactly midnight. I had been sitting in the dark of my living room for 3 hours waiting for the inevitable. The sharp warning from Blake's phone call had given me all the tactical intelligence I needed. My son and his wife were backed into a corner, and desperate predators do not wait for the morning light. The heavy brass tumblers of my front door clicked with agonizing slowness. They were trying to be quiet, using the spare key I gave DeAndre a decade ago for emergencies. The heavy oak door swung open, casting a long, jagged shadow across the hardwood floor. Heather stepped inside first, wearing a dark trench coat, her designer heels clicking softly against the floorboards. DeAndre followed closely behind her, clutching a thick manila folder tightly against his chest. In Heather's right hand, she carried a large insulated travel mug. It was not from a coffee shop. It was one of my own mugs from the kitchen cabinet, which meant she had stopped at the counter to prepare it before stepping fully into the living room. I remained perfectly still in my armchair, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket. The streetlights filtering through the blinds illuminated their faces, revealing a mixture of raw panic and cold-blooded ambition. They were not here to check on my well-being. They had come to execute Plan B just as Blake ordered. The folder DeAndre held contained the emergency guardianship paperwork they intended to force me to sign while under the influence of whatever heavy sedative Heather had just stirred into that steaming cup of dark roast coffee. I let out a loud, ragged sigh and slumped deeper into the armchair, simulating the exact posture of an exhausted, disoriented old man abruptly woken from a deep sleep. I rubbed my eyes heavily and stammered, asking them what time it was and why the house was so cold. DeAndre approached with a rigid, artificial smile that made my stomach turn. He knelt in front of my chair, speaking in a slow, patronizing tone, assuring me that everything was fine and they had just come to help me manage some confusing legal paperwork. Heather stepped forward, placing the steaming insulated mug directly on the glass coffee table in front of my knees. She sat down on the adjacent sofa, placing her own identical travel mug next to mine. She told me she made my favorite dark roast to help clear my foggy head. She insisted I take a few large sips before looking at the documents, claiming the warmth would soothe my aging nerves. I nodded weakly, keeping my hands trembling as I reached out to touch the ceramic rim. I mumbled a pathetic thank you, leaning forward as if I could barely keep my head upright. DeAndre placed the thick stack of guardianship papers on the table right next to the poisoned coffee. He patted his jacket pockets, realizing he had not brought a pen to secure the fraudulent signature. He turned to Heather, his voice laced with sudden irritation, demanding she find one immediately. Heather rolled her eyes, letting out a sharp sigh of annoyance. She stood up and turned her back to the coffee table, marching toward my home office down the hall to retrieve a pen from my desk. DeAndre stood up as well, walking toward the front window to check the street, nervous that a neighbor might have seen them enter. The moment both of their backs were completely turned, my manufactured frailty instantly vanished. I moved with the swift, silent precision of a seasoned engineer. My hands stopped shaking. I reached across the glass table, grabbed the handle of my poisoned mug, and seamlessly swapped its position with Heather's identical mug. The entire maneuver took less than 2 seconds. I settled back into my armchair, pulling the heavy wool blanket up to my chin, and immediately resumed my pathetic, trembling posture. Heather marched back into the living room, holding a silver pen, completely unaware that her lethal concoction was now sitting exactly where she had left her own drink. DeAndre snatched the silver pen from Heather's hand and slammed it down onto the guardianship documents. He pointed to the dotted line at the bottom of the page, his voice dropping its fake warmth and adopting a cold, ruthless edge. He commanded me to stop stalling, drink the coffee, and sign the papers immediately. He claimed the city required these forms by morning to protect my assets from being seized by the government. The lie was sloppy, born out of extreme desperation. I picked up the mug currently sitting in front of me, letting my hands shake violently enough to slosh a few drops of hot liquid over the rim. I brought it to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip of the untainted black coffee. I looked up at my son, letting the silence stretch, playing the role of a defeated, broken man submitting to his authority. Heather sat back down on the sofa, crossing her legs with a triumphant, arrogant smirk. She was absolutely certain she had won. Believing her job was done, she reached out and grabbed the insulated mug sitting on her side of the glass table. She did not hesitate. She brought the rim to her lips and took a long, deep swallow of the scalding, dark liquid. I watched her swallow the heavy sedative without breaking eye contact with my son. DeAndre tapped the legal paperwork, impatiently demanding I pick up the pen and write my name. I slowly placed my mug back onto the glass table, resting my hands on my lap. I did not reach for the pen. I simply sat there staring at Heather, waiting for the precise chemical reaction her hired doctor had undoubtedly promised. Heather tried to speak, but the words died in her throat. Her triumphant smirk melted into an expression of profound confusion. The heavy sedative was industrial grade, acting with terrifying speed. The ceramic mug slipped from her manicured fingers, crashing onto the hardwood floor and spilling dark liquid across the rug. Her eyes rolled back into her head, showing only the whites as her entire body went completely slack. She slumped forward, violently crashing face first onto the thick glass coffee table with a sickening thud before sliding off and hitting the floor. DeAndre froze his face, draining of all color. He dropped the guardianship papers, staring at his wife's motionless body in absolute horror. He dropped to his knees, shaking her shoulders aggressively. When she did not respond, he unleashed a visceral, panicked scream and frantically pulled out his phone to dial for an ambulance. The wail of the ambulance sirens faded into the cold city night, leaving my living room in absolute silence. DeAndre had ridden in the back of the emergency transport, gripping his unconscious wife by the hand and weeping uncontrollably. He was so consumed by the sudden, inexplicable collapse of his partner that he completely forgot the guardianship papers still lying on my hardwood floor. I picked up the fraudulent documents, fed them directly into my industrial paper shredder, and immediately walked out the front door. The stakes had elevated from a greedy family dispute into attempted murder, and I needed complete visibility of their financial rot. I drove straight back to the coastal property, pushing my vehicle hard down the empty highway. By the time I reached the rusted iron gates, the sun was just beginning to bleach the horizon. Tevin was waiting for me inside the climate-controlled garage, holding a mug of black coffee. I did not waste time explaining the attempted poisoning. I simply told my grandson we needed to find out exactly how much money Blake and DeAndre were bleeding. Tevin led me past the vintage Shelby Cobra and into the back glass-walled office. He booted up a custom-built secure terminal that Sylvia had secretly installed to monitor the estate vast portfolio. The dual monitors flared to life, casting a harsh blue glow across Tevin's face. He pulled the thick leather ledgers from the steel safe and cracked his knuckles. He initiated a secure encrypted connection, routing our IP address through multiple offshore proxies, just as Sylvia had taught him. The digital fortress my wife built was not just a shield, but a powerful surveillance weapon. I handed Tevin the routing numbers I had memorized from Blake's fraudulent demolition permit. We were going to trace every single dollar my treacherous son and son-in-law had ever touched. Tevin typed with a rapid, methodical intensity, cross-referencing the account numbers from Sylvia's meticulous handwritten ledgers against the county public property tax database. I stood behind his chair, watching the cascading lines of data populate the screen. We bypassed the standard commercial banking firewalls, utilizing a backdoor access point Sylvia had secured through her high-level corporate legal contacts. The digital footprint Blake and DeAndre left behind was sloppy, arrogant, and entirely desperate. Tevin isolated DeAndre's primary residence, a luxury suburban mansion that my son constantly paraded as proof of his self-made success. The screen flashed, bringing up the official county registry deed. I leaned closer, resting my hands on the back of the heavy leather office chair. A glaring red flag immediately dominated the financial summary. Just 3 weeks ago, DeAndre had leveraged the entire equity of his pristine suburban home. He had executed a massive high-interest second mortgage, borrowing roughly $1.2 million against the property. The predatory interest rate attached to the loan indicated he had bypassed traditional reputable banking institutions and utilized an aggressive private shadow lender. The sheer magnitude of the financial suicide was staggering. DeAndre had literally bet his family shelter and survival on a single desperate play. Tevin tracked the destination of the $1.2 million wire transfer. The money did not go into DeAndre's personal savings or a legitimate retirement fund. The entire sum was wired directly into a corporate holding account registered to Blake Real Estate Development Firm. DeAndre had liquefied his entire life to become a silent angel investor in Blake Phantom Coastal Resort Project. This was the hidden catalyst behind their relentless urgency. When Oliver Stanton and I activated the blind trust and legally locked the 50 acres of coastal land, we did not just ruin a business deal. We instantly vaporized DeAndre's entire net worth. He was completely trapped in a toxic financial alliance with Blake. If Blake could not deliver the land to his foreign billionaires, the shadow lenders would legally foreclose on DeAndre's luxury mansion, leaving him and Heather absolutely destitute. The puzzle pieces locked together with sickening clarity. This crippling financial ruin was exactly why DeAndre was willing to drug me in the middle of the night. He was facing total bankruptcy and public humiliation. He needed to seize my estate to cover his disastrous investment. Tevin pulled up the corporate tracking logs, tracing how Blake received the massive influx of cash from my son. The ledger clearly showed the $1.2 million hitting Blake's corporate account. I instructed Tevin to follow that specific money trail deep into Blake's personal banking network to see exactly how he allocated the funds for the supposed construction project. The command prompt executed a deep trace on Blake's corporate holding accounts. Tevin opened the primary ledger, displaying Blake's operating capital. The balance on the screen read 0. My grandson ran the diagnostic trace 3 consecutive times, assuming a software glitch had corrupted the data retrieval. The result was exactly the same every single time. The massive influx of cash DeAndre had sacrificed his home to provide was completely gone. Blake had not spent a single dime of that $1.2 million on construction equipment, surveying permits, or architectural development. Tevin cracked the transaction history, mapping the outgoing wire transfers. Blake was operating a textbook catastrophic Ponzi scheme. The moment DeAndre money cleared the bank, Blake immediately fragmented the funds and wired them to a dozen different offshore accounts to pay off the interest owed to his previous furious investors. He was desperately robbing Peter to pay Paul, cycling fresh capital from my son to temporarily silence the dangerous men he had defrauded months ago. Blake's entire real estate empire was a fragile house of cards built entirely on lies, forged documents, and stolen equity. He had absolutely zero liquid assets left. The foreign billionaires he met with were completely unaware that his accounts were entirely drained. My son-in-law was not a visionary developer. He was a cornered, desperate thief who had successfully conned his own brother-in-law into funding his criminal survival. The staggering reality of their financial apocalypse settled over the quiet garage. Blake had systematically burned bridges with men who did not use lawyers to settle their debts. He had played a lethal game of financial roulette, and the house had finally won. They had absolutely nothing left to lose, and dangerous people were bound to come collecting. The sharp, aggressive vibration of my cell phone broke the heavy silence in the glass office. I pulled the device from my coat pocket and checked the glowing screen. It was Kendra calling. I pressed the answer button, raising the phone to my ear, expecting another bout of her manipulative, manufactured sobbing. But the voice that greeted me was not performing a rehearsed script. It was a raw, breathless whisper choked with absolute, genuine terror. She was speaking so quietly, I had to press the speaker tightly against my ear to make out the words over the sound of her frantic, shallow breathing. "Dad," she gasped, her voice shaking violently as a loud crash echoed in the background. "You need to help me. Blake investors just broke through the back door. They are inside my house right now. They have guns." I instructed Kendra to lock herself in a bathroom, climb out the egress window, and drive directly to my city house without looking back. I told her I was already on my way. I left Tevin at the coastal compound with strict orders to keep the security system armed and drove back to the city at reckless speeds. When I pulled into my driveway an hour later, Kendra was already there. She was pacing frantically on my front porch, still wearing her silk pajamas, shivering in the brisk morning air. The moment I unlocked the front door, she pushed past me, practically collapsing into the entryway. She was completely hysterical, grabbing the lapels of my coat with trembling hands. She screamed that the armed men had torn her house apart, searching for Blake. Blake had managed to slip out the back door and flee in his luxury sedan, leaving his own wife behind to face the wrath of the violent investors he had defrauded. Kendra fell to her knees on my hardwood floor, tears streaming down her face, begging me to save her husband. She pleaded with me to lift the blind trust sign over the 50 acres of coastal property and let Blake sell the land to the foreign billionaires. She claimed the millions from the resort deal were the absolute only way to pay off the shadow lenders and keep Blake from being executed in the streets. She spun a frantic, desperate narrative framing Blake as a victim of bad business luck who just needed one final financial bailout to save their family from total annihilation. I stood over my kneeling daughter, looking down at her tear-stained face, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, heavy calculation. I grabbed Kendra by the shoulders and pulled her up from the floor, guiding her firmly to the living room sofa. I did not offer her a glass of water or a comforting embrace. I stood directly in front of her, folding my arms across my chest, projecting the unyielding authority of a man who held all the cards. I looked her dead in the eyes and demanded the absolute truth. I told her I knew exactly what Blake was running. I laid out the precise mechanics of his pathetic Ponzi scheme, detailing how he drained DeAndre of $1.2 million just to pay off the furious investors who had supposedly stormed her house this morning. Kendra froze, her sobbing instantly halting as the shock of my financial intelligence registered on her face. The fragile, helpless daughter routine fractured. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a sharp, menacing whisper, and began my interrogation. I asked her point blank when she found out about the forged signature on the coastal transfer deed. She tried to stammer and deny it, but I cut her off immediately, demanding she stop insulting my intelligence. I laid out the timeline, trapping her in her own lies. I demanded to know if she was aware that Heather and DeAndre had brought a hired mercenary into my home to falsely diagnose me with severe cognitive decline. I pressed her relentlessly, breaking down her defenses until she finally cracked. She looked away, her voice trembling with a shameful admission. She confessed she knew everything. She knew Blake had forged Sylvia's signature because they were drowning in debt. She knew DeAndre was planning to commit me to a psychiatric ward to seize my assets. She admitted she stayed completely silent because she needed my land to salvage her lavish lifestyle. She tried to justify her complicity, claiming she was just trying to protect her marriage and survive the financial collapse. The magnitude of her betrayal hung heavily in the quiet living room. My own daughter had actively watched her husband and brother orchestrate my destruction and chose to do absolutely nothing. I straightened my posture, looking down at her with pure, unfiltered disappointment. I told her I would give her full protection in my home. I offered to hire her the best divorce attorney in the city and shield her from the violent men looking for her husband. But I stated with absolute, unwavering finality that I would rather watch Blake rot in a federal prison or face the street justice of his creditors than surrender a single grain of Sylvia coastal sand to save him. Kendra stared at me in stunned silence. The realization that I was completely immune to her emotional manipulation finally settled over her. The remorse and vulnerability she had weaponized just moments ago instantly evaporated, replaced by a sudden, vicious anger. She jumped up from the sofa, her fists clenched tightly at her sides. She screamed that I was a cold, ruthless old man who cared more about a rusted plot of dirt than the survival of his own flesh and blood. She accused me of letting my grief turn me into a monster, claiming that Sylvia would be absolutely disgusted by my refusal to save their family from ruin. She shouted that I was deliberately condemning her husband to a brutal death simply to satisfy my own petty, vengeful ego. I did not raise my voice to match her hysteria. I simply told her that Blake condemned himself the moment he decided to steal from dangerous men and forge the signature of a dead woman. I reminded her that true family does not facilitate the mental and financial execution of their own father. She hurled every vile insult she could muster, trying to strike a nerve and provoke a violent reaction from me. She demanded to know how I could sleep at night knowing her life was in ruins. I stood perfectly still, offering her no reaction, no anger, and no forgiveness. Her words bounced off me like gravel against reinforced steel. Realizing she had utterly failed to break my resolve, Kendra unleashed a final guttural scream of frustration, cursing my name and swearing that I would die completely alone in this massive, empty house. She snatched her purse from the entryway table, marched toward the front door, and yanked it open. She did not look back. She stormed out into the crisp morning air and slammed the heavy oak door behind her with enough violent force to rattle the windows in their frames. I watched her march down the driveway through the living room blinds. Kendra did not look like a terrified woman fleeing from armed mobsters anymore. Her stride was purposeful, completely devoid of the panic she had brought into my home. She reached her luxury sedan, unlocked the door, and slid into the driver's seat. As she closed the car door, I saw her pull her smartphone from her coat pocket. She did not dial 911 or call Blake to warn him of my refusal. She opened a hidden application on her screen and firmly pressed the stop button on a continuous voice recording. She had not come to my house seeking sanctuary from violent loan sharks. The entire break-in story was a brilliantly acted, desperate fabrication. She came to bait me into sounding delusional, aggressive, and entirely uncooperative on tape. She was gathering the exact manipulated audio evidence DeAndre needed for the emergency guardianship hearing to strip me of my rights. By noon the following day, a uniformed court courier knocked on my front door and handed me a thick, sealed manila envelope. I did not need to open it to know what was inside. DeAndre and Blake had officially executed their legal strike. They filed an emergency petition in the county family court to permanently strip me of my legal rights, my financial autonomy, and my personal liberty. I sat at my dining table and reviewed the enclosed affidavits. The sheer brazenness of their legal strategy was impressive in its cruelty. Attached to the petition was a transcribed excerpt of the audio recording Kendra had captured just 24 hours ago. However, the transcription was entirely butchered. They had meticulously edited out her hysterical screaming, her demands for money, and my calm, reasoned explanations of Blake's massive financial fraud. The only audio they submitted to the court was my cold, uncompromising voice flatly refusing to save my own son-in-law from execution and stating I would rather watch him rot. Out of context, it painted the exact picture they needed for a judge. It framed me as a deeply disturbed, aggressive, and highly delusional old man who possessed zero empathy and posed an imminent threat to the safety of my own family. DeAndre included a sworn statement citing my sudden irrational cancellation of family funds and my supposed barricading of the coastal property as definitive proof of severe cognitive collapse. They requested an immediate expedited hearing to grant DeAndre full conservatorship over my entire estate. They thought they had backed me into an inescapable legal corner, wrapping a noose of my own words around my neck. They were absolutely certain I would panic and surrender. I did not panic. I did not call DeAndre to negotiate or beg for mercy. I picked up my phone and summoned Oliver Stanton to my home. The ruthless estate lawyer arrived within the hour, carrying his signature leather briefcase and projecting absolute surgical calm. I handed him the court summons and watched his eyes scan the manipulated transcription. He did not look worried. He looked like a predator smelling blood in the water. He asked if I wanted to file a motion to delay the hearing or contest the validity of the audio recording. I shook my head, rejecting the defensive maneuver entirely. I told Oliver we were not going to delay the hearing. We were going to walk right into their courtroom and let them present their fabricated case to the judge. I walked over to my home office and retrieved the heavy leather satchel I had prepared the night before. I placed it on the dining table and unzipped the main compartment. It was time to unleash the arsenal Sylvia and I had built. I handed Oliver the pristine high-definition video file captured by the hidden camera Heather had foolishly planted in my own vase. The footage clearly showed DeAndre and Heather illegally entering my home at midnight and tampering with my coffee. Next, I handed him the crisp, unedited digital audio recording I had captured from my breast pocket. It contained the complete damning conversation with the fake Dr. Aris, including his explicit demand for the $5,000 cash bribe Heather paid him using my stolen funeral funds. Finally, I placed the original untampered ledgers and Sylvia's genuine signature samples right next to the shoddy forged transfer deed Blake had attempted to use at the coast. Oliver reviewed the staggering mountain of federal evidence spread across my table. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. He realized exactly what I was doing. I was not just defending myself against a conservatorship. I was handing him the definitive proof required to secure multiple felony convictions. If we presented this evidence in a closed family court, we would not just win the hearing, we would instantly trigger a grand jury investigation. Oliver gathered the files, his movements sharp and energized. He promised me he would have a team of forensic audio analysts verify the recordings by midnight. We were going to let DeAndre and Blake dig their own graves in front of a sitting judge. The legal machinery moved with terrifying speed. Operating out of his downtown firm, Oliver Stanton drafted a relentless volley of subpoenas. He did not just prepare a defense, he engineered an absolute legal massacre. He drafted official court summons for the corrupt magistrate who had rubber-stamped Blake's emergency demolition permit in the middle of the night. He filed a subpoena to compel the testimony of the fake medical specialist Dr. Aris, guaranteeing the man would have to explain his $10,000 bribe under the threat of federal perjury charges. Oliver even prepared a subpoena for Kendra, legally forcing her to produce the unedited raw audio file from her smartphone or face severe obstruction of justice penalties. The trap was flawlessly laid. DeAndre and Blake believed they were walking into a simple, uncontested family court proceeding to quietly execute a hostile takeover of my estate. They had absolutely no idea that Oliver was transforming their routine hearing into a fully armed federal tribunal. Every single lie they had manufactured over the past 48 hours was now documented, time-stamped, and bound in heavy legal folders waiting for the judge. I sat in my quiet living room looking at the empty armchair where Heather had collapsed just a few nights prior. The board was set, the pieces were locked into their inevitable positions. All I had to do was put on a dark suit, walk into the courtroom, and watch my greedy, arrogant family systematically destroy their own lives. I was pouring a fresh cup of coffee, mentally preparing for the upcoming legal slaughter when my cell phone vibrated violently against the granite countertop. It was Oliver Stanton. I answered the call, expecting a routine update on the forensic audio analysis. Instead, Oliver's usually composed voice was tense, sharp, and urgent. He told me he had just received a critical alert from the private security firm he retained to monitor the county police dispatch scanners. DeAndre had not waited for the judge. Knowing his financial collapse was imminent, my son had decided to bypass the legal system entirely. Oliver informed me that 2 unmarked vans had just breached the perimeter of the coastal property. DeAndre had hired a crew of desperate, violent local thugs, and they were currently surrounding Tevin's restoration garage, armed with heavy baseball bats and steel crowbars. I dropped the phone on the passenger seat and slammed my foot on the accelerator. My heavy sedan tore through the city limits, heading straight for the coast. Oliver Stanton had already dispatched the county sheriff to the compound, but I knew emergency response times on the coastal highway were terribly slow. I tapped the screen of my phone, bringing up the live security feed Sylvia had secretly installed around the perimeter of the garage. The night vision cameras displayed a terrifying scene of coordinated violence. 2 unmarked white vans were parked aggressively across the gravel driveway, blocking any possible exit. 8 men dressed in dark clothing were swarming the multi-million-dollar restoration facility. They wielded heavy wooden baseball bats and thick steel crowbars, smashing them viciously against the reinforced glass bay doors. The specialized hurricane glass splintered and spiderwebbed under the repeated heavy impacts, but held its structural integrity just long enough to prevent an immediate breach. Inside the dark garage, I could see the thermal outline of my newly discovered grandson. Tevin had retreated to the back office, barricading the heavy steel door behind him. He was completely surrounded and heavily outnumbered, but he was not panicking. He stood perfectly still in the dark, gripping the heavy pump-action shotgun he had pointed at me just a few days prior. He kept the barrel aimed directly at the primary entry point, waiting for the reinforced glass to finally give way. He was a teenager facing down a mob of hired mercenaries, but he held his ground with the cold, calculated discipline of a veteran soldier defending his fortress. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached, praying the glass would hold for just 10 more minutes. The sound of shattering glass finally echoed through the audio feed of my phone. One of the thugs used a heavy steel sledgehammer to completely cave in the lower half of the main bay door. The men poured into the pristine garage, stepping over the jagged shards of hurricane glass and trampling across the immaculate epoxy floors. They began aggressively smashing the hoods of the restored classic cars, causing thousands of dollars in senseless damage just to send a message of total destruction. Stepping through the shattered entrance behind his hired muscle was my own son. DeAndre wore a dark jacket, his face twisted in an ugly mask of desperate rage. He had completely abandoned the sophisticated facade of a wealthy suburban developer. He was now operating as a common street thug. He marched toward the back office where Tevin was barricaded, kicking the heavy steel door with his expensive leather boot. He screamed at the top of his lungs, demanding that the squatter open the door immediately and vacate the premises. He shouted that the land belonged to his development firm, and that if the door was not unlocked in 10 seconds, his men would tear the place down with the squatter inside. DeAndre had absolutely no idea that the young man holding a loaded shotgun on the other side of that door was the infant son he had paid to erase 15 years ago. He thought he was intimidating a random mechanic Sylvia had hired off the street. I crested the final coastal ridge and hit a button on my dashboard console, syncing my phone to the compound's central security mainframe. Sylvia had not just built a garage. She had engineered a highly secure compound designed to repel aggressive intruders. I bypassed the standard alarm protocols and accessed the perimeter defense grid. I did not trigger a loud siren. I opted for total visual domination. I pressed the activation command, perfectly timing my arrival. In an instant, the entire 50-acre coastal compound was bathed in blinding, blistering white light. 24 military-grade halogen security floodlights mounted along the roofline and the eastern ridge ignited simultaneously. The sheer intensity of the illumination completely eradicated the darkness, turning the dead of night into aggressive artificial high noon. The sudden, blinding glare struck the thugs with physical force, causing them to drop their crowbars and shield their eyes in absolute panic. DeAndre stumbled backward away from the office door, crying out and raising his arms to block the searing light. Their tactical advantage of darkness was instantly vaporized, leaving them completely exposed and illuminated like trapped rodents on a sterile laboratory floor. The moment the compound lit up, the piercing wail of county sheriff sirens tore through the coastal air. I slammed my sedan into the gravel driveway at the exact same moment 3 police cruisers swarmed the front gate. Their red and blue emergency lights sliced through the brilliant white floodlights, creating a chaotic strobe effect across the sand. The hired thugs instantly realized they had walked directly into a massive tactical trap. They did not attempt to fight or protect their employer. They completely abandoned DeAndre, scattering like cockroaches toward the dense brush along the eastern ridge, desperately trying to escape the encroaching police perimeter. The officers poured out of their vehicles with their weapons drawn, shouting commands that echoed over the roaring ocean waves. DeAndre stood frozen in the center of the illuminated garage, completely blinded and entirely disoriented. He He turned wildly toward the shattered bay doors looking for his unmarked white vans, but the police cruisers had already barricaded the exit route. He tried to sprint toward the tree line, but his expensive shoes slipped violently on the loose coastal sand. A heavily armored sheriff deputy closed the distance in 3 massive strides, hitting DeAndre squarely in the back. The sheer force of the tackle drove my son face first into the coarse dirt, completely knocking the wind out of his lungs. 2 more officers swarmed him, pinning his arms behind his back and violently snapping heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. I stepped out of my sedan, walking calmly across the illuminated gravel. I watched the police drag my struggling son up from the dirt, his face scraped and bleeding from the harsh impact with the earth. DeAndre thrashed wildly against the grip of the arresting officers. He spat sand from his mouth and locked his furious, bloodshot eyes onto my face. He screamed at the top of his lungs, demanding the officers unhand him. He shrieked that the arrest was an illegal outrage, claiming the entire 50 acres was his rightful property, and that I was a demented old man who had no legal authority to call the police. The heavy steel door of the back office clicked open. Tevin stepped out of the blinding halogen glare, lowering his shotgun to his side. He walked slowly across the shattered glass, stopping just a few feet away from the handcuffed man bleeding in the sand. Tevin looked DeAndre dead in the eyes, his voice carrying a cold, unyielding weight. "No," he said smoothly. "It is mine." "Hello, Dad." The single word hung suspended in the harsh glare of the halogen floodlights. "Dad." DeAndre stopped thrashing against the heavy grip of the arresting deputies. The frantic animalistic rage contorting his face instantly evaporated, replaced by a pale, hollow mask of absolute shock. He stared at the grease-stained teenager standing amidst the shattered glass of the hurricane doors. He recognized the shape of the boy's jawline, the exact shade of his eyes, and the defiant, unyielding posture that mirrored my own. 15 years ago, DeAndre had paid a desperate college girl to erase this child from existence, prioritizing his pristine suburban narrative and Heather's shallow social climbing over his own flesh and blood. Now the ghost of his ruthless ambition was standing directly in front of him, holding a shotgun and claiming ownership of the very ground beneath his bleeding knees. The devastating reality of the legal ambush finally crashed down upon my son. The mysterious squatter he had hired violent thugs to evict was not a random mechanic. Tevin was the sole, irrevocable beneficiary of the blind trust Sylvia had masterminded. DeAndre realized in real time that he had not just attacked an employee, he had ordered an armed assault on a $30 million heir, completely cementing his own criminal ruin. Sylvia had quietly nurtured the exact seed DeAndre had thrown away, watering it with her vast hidden wealth until it grew into an impenetrable fortress. DeAndre opened his mouth, trying to formulate a defense, trying to speak the name of the son he had never bothered to learn. But no words came out. The sheer crushing gravity of his colossal failure choked him into a pathetic, defeated silence. He simply collapsed against the deputies, his knees buckling into the damp coastal sand. The officers hauled DeAndre off the sand, practically dragging his limp, defeated body toward the flashing red and blue lights of the lead cruiser. They shoved him roughly into the cramped, reinforced back seat, the heavy door slamming shut with a sharp, metallic clank. Through the reinforced plexiglass partition, DeAndre begged the arresting sergeant for a single phone call, citing his legal right to contact his attorney. The sergeant obliged, rolling the rear window down exactly 2 inches and slipping a department-issued mobile phone through the narrow gap. DeAndre did not call a criminal defense lawyer. With trembling, blood-stained fingers, he frantically dialed Heather. He needed his wife to drain their remaining emergency accounts, hire elite legal counsel, and post his bail before the morning news cycle caught wind of his arrest. The line rang 3 times before Heather answered. Her voice was sharp, hushed, and laced with absolute panic. She was not sleeping in their luxury suburban mansion. DeAndre practically sobbed into the receiver, begging her to drive down to the county precinct immediately. He rapidly confessed that the raid was a catastrophic failure, that the police had arrested him for felony trespassing, and that the mechanic inside the garage was the exact son they had paid to abort 15 years ago. He pleaded with her to leverage her parents' money to save him from a severe prison sentence. Heather did not offer a single word of comfort. She did not gasp in shock or promise to deploy a legal team. The silence on the other end of the line was venomous. When she finally spoke, her tone was completely devoid of the fierce loyalty she usually projected. She informed DeAndre that federal agents were currently circling Blake Development Firm, and she refused to let his botched assault drag her down into a criminal conspiracy. She coldly stated that she had warned him not to use hired thugs, completely revising history to distance herself from his failure. DeAndre wept, begging her not to abandon him, reminding her that he had taken out the massive second mortgage on their home strictly to fund the lifestyle she demanded. Heather laughed a sharp, cruel sound that pierced the static of the phone connection. She told him their house was already in active foreclosure and their joint accounts were frozen. She declared that she was filing for immediate divorce to protect herself from his criminal liability. Before DeAndre could utter another desperate plea, Heather abruptly disconnected the call. The dial tone echoed loudly in the confined space of the police cruiser. She had severed the dead weight of their marriage without a second thought, leaving him completely isolated in his ruin. I walked slowly across the illuminated gravel, stepping into the harsh glow of the cruiser emergency lights. I stopped inches from the reinforced rear window, looking down at my son. DeAndre was hyperventilating, his forehead pressed against the cold glass, tears streaming down his bruised and dirt-streaked face. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with the desperate, terrified realization that he was entirely out of allies. He pressed his bound hands against the plexiglass, silently begging for the unconditional paternal mercy I had freely given him for decades. He expected the father who had funded his college, paid for his lavish wedding, and covered his early business failures to magically wave a hand and dismiss the armed police officers. I did not flinch. I did not offer a single ounce of warmth or forgiveness. I stared at him with absolute glacial detachment, viewing him not as my blood, but as a hostile predator I had successfully neutralized. The arresting sergeant stepped forward holding a digital tablet and respectfully asked me if I wanted to formally press charges for the breach of my security gates and the severe damage to the classic vehicles inside. I did not hesitate. I turned to the sergeant, my voice carrying the unyielding authority of a commanding officer. I instructed him to process DeAndre Reynolds for aggravated felony trespassing, destruction of private property, and conspiracy to commit assault. I clearly stated that I wanted him placed in a maximum security holding cell and explicitly denied any option for a reduced bail hearing. The sergeant nodded, tapping the screen of his tablet to finalize the criminal booking. I looked back at DeAndre one last time, watching his pathetic realization that I was locking the cage myself. Miles away in the sterile penthouse of his corporate headquarters, Blake was completely oblivious to the tactical annihilation of his partner. He sat behind his sleek mahogany desk, his smartphone buzzing with ignored calls from DeAndre Precinct. Blake silenced the notifications, refusing to let his brother-in-law incompetence distract him from his ultimate financial salvation. He opened his encrypted email client and drafted a high-priority message to the consortium of foreign billionaires he was desperately attempting to defraud. His fingers danced aggressively across the keyboard, typing a massive, arrogant lie. He assured the investors that the hostile coastal takeover was entirely successful, claiming the demented previous owner was legally locked out of the compound and the heavy demolition phase would commence by noon. He hit send, confidently finalizing the message stating we sign the $10 million capital disbursement tomorrow at 9 sharp. He smiled, utterly unaware of the federal execution waiting for him at dawn. At exactly 9 the following morning, Blake stood at the head of a massive obsidian conference table on the top floor of his downtown corporate headquarters. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting an aura of manufactured success over the room. Seated around the table were 3 foreign billionaires, men who controlled vast international portfolios and demanded absolute perfection. Blake had spared no expense for this critical presentation. Catered espresso, imported sparkling water, and thick, glossy portfolios rested perfectly in front of each investor. In the center of the table sat an intricately detailed architectural scale model of the proposed coastal resort. Miniature palm trees, tiny luxury yachts docked at a pristine marina, and a sweeping glass hotel complex completely replaced the footprint of Sylvia's hidden garage. Blake moved with a practiced, arrogant grace. He clicked a remote, illuminating a massive digital screen behind him with high-definition, 3-dimensional renderings of the resort. He pointed to the projected ocean views, his voice dripping with absolute confidence. He spun a masterful narrative describing the 50 acres of coastal property as a completely untapped gold mine, a diamond in the rough, that his firm had aggressively and exclusively secured. He assured the billionaires that the municipal zoning boards were already bought and paid for, guaranteeing a seamless transition from demolition to construction. The investors leaned forward, their sharp eyes analyzing the projected profit margins, and the sheer scale of the proposed luxury complex. They were captivated by the illusion. Blake was orchestrating the pitch of his life, fully believing he was just minutes away from securing the $10 million wire transfer that would save him from the dangerous shadow lenders hunting him down. The lead investor, a stern, impeccably dressed man named Mr. Volkov, raised a hand to pause the presentation. He did not look at the glossy architectural models. He looked directly at Blake, his voice heavily accented and strictly business. He noted that their risk assessment team had flagged a potential legal hurdle regarding the current title holder of the coastal land. Volkov demanded concrete assurance that the elderly owner would not suddenly halt the development with a prolonged, messy civil lawsuit. Blake smiled a wide, predatory grin that signaled he was perfectly prepared for the question. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick legal binder, sliding it smoothly across the obsidian table toward the billionaire. Blake smoothly explained that the previous owner was a tragic case, a severely demented hostile senior citizen who had completely lost his grip on reality after the recent passing of his wife. Blake claimed that for the safety of the public and the integrity of the project, his firm had been forced to take decisive legal action. He clicked the remote again, changing the display on the massive screen. A high-resolution scan of the fake medical certificate materialized behind him. The forged document clearly displayed the hired mercenary doctor diagnosis, officially branding me as suffering from advanced aggressive cognitive decline. Blake confidently pointed to the fraudulent notary seal, assuring the room that the medical evaluation had already been processed by the municipal family court. To entirely cement his lie, Blake grabbed his smartphone and connected it to the boardroom surround sound system. He told the investors he had undeniable audio proof of the owner's violent instability captured legally by a terrified family member. The manipulated recording of Kendra's voice echoed through the pristine boardroom. The billionaires listened to my cold, heavily edited voice, flatly refusing to save a family member and issuing what sounded like an aggressive, delusional threat. The edited clip was a masterpiece of character assassination, completely stripping away my rationale and leaving only a chilling manufactured cruelty. Blake lowered the volume, projecting a fake sympathetic sigh. He assured the investors that the emergency conservatorship was already active, legally neutralizing the insane owner and granting his firm total unchecked authority to demolish the site and transfer the deed. He firmly stated that there were absolutely zero legal obstacles remaining, pressing Volkov to authorize the $10 million capital disbursement right now. Mr. Volkov reached into his tailored suit jacket and withdrew a heavy gold fountain pen. He opened the signature page of the disbursement contract, fully satisfied with the fabricated evidence Blake had just presented. Blake held his breath, his eyes locked greedily onto the tip of the pen, realizing his financial salvation was merely seconds away. Before the gold nib could even touch the crisp white paper, the heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom swung open with a violent, authoritative crash. The sudden noise shattered the tense, quiet atmosphere of the high-stakes meeting. Blake snapped his head up, his smug, victorious smile instantly freezing. I walked directly into the center of the room. I was not wearing the grieving, rumpled clothes of a broken widower, nor was I shaking like the demented old fool Blake had just described. I wore an immaculate, razor-sharp, charcoal-tailored suit. My posture was perfectly straight, my expression an impenetrable mask of absolute, calculated dominance. I moved with the precise, intimidating weight of a man who owned the entire building. Walking closely at my side was Oliver Stanton, carrying his signature leather briefcase, radiating the lethal, polished energy of a corporate executioner. We did not wait for an invitation, nor did we apologize for the interruption. We bypassed the shocked reception staff trailing behind us and stepped right up to the edge of the obsidian table. I looked directly at the three foreign billionaires, then slowly turned my gaze to my cornered, terrified son-in-law. The sheer physical presence of the supposedly insane, neutralized property owner standing flawlessly in their private boardroom instantly drained the color from Blake's face. Blake slammed his hands down on the polished table, his perfectly constructed facade instantly fracturing into pure raw panic. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his voice cracking as he desperately tried to regain control of the room. He sneered aggressively, demanding that building security immediately remove the hostile trespasser before I compromised the meeting. He shouted that my unhinged intrusion was exact, undeniable proof of the aggressive dementia he had just outlined. The two large security guards stepped forward, reaching out to grab my shoulders and drag me out of the suite. I did not flinch, and I did not step back. Mr. Volkov slowly capped his gold fountain pen. He raised a single commanding hand, instantly halting the security guards in their tracks. The billionaire looked past Blake, his sharp eyes locking onto mine. Let him speak. The absolute silence in the boardroom was thick enough to suffocate my son-in-law. I stepped aside, allowing Oliver Stanton to command the center of the obsidian table. Oliver did not waste a single breath addressing Blake. He operated with the lethal efficiency of a corporate surgeon. He unlatched his heavy leather briefcase, the metallic click echoing loudly across the room. He pulled out 3 pristine, thick legal packets and slid them smoothly across the polished glass surface directly into the hands of the foreign billionaires. Mr. Volkov did not hesitate. He opened the folder, his sharp eyes immediately scanning the heavy federal watermarks and the raised notary seals. Oliver spoke in a calm, resonant voice that dismantled every single lie Blake had just presented. He introduced the documents as the irrevocable blind trust established by Sylvia and myself. He explained with absolute legal clarity that the 50 acres of coastal land had been permanently shielded from public domain and probate court long before my wife passed away. He pointed directly to the transfer clause, explicitly naming my grandson Tevin as the sole untouchable beneficiary. Oliver then produced the official county records proving that the transfer deed Blake had submitted to their risk assessment team was a complete amateurish forgery. Blake had absolutely zero legal standing, zero property rights, and absolutely no authority to authorize a demolition or negotiate a commercial development on that coastline. The land Blake was attempting to sell them did not belong to him, and it never would. The investors flipped through the irrefutable federal documents, cross-referencing the dates and the signatures. The illusion of Blake Massive Coastal Resort instantly evaporated, replaced by the grim, undeniable reality of a colossal real estate fraud. Blake stood paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. I stepped forward, moving right into the space Blake had occupied just moments ago. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small, high-fidelity Bluetooth speaker. I placed it gently in the exact center of the table, right next to the absurd architectural model of the fake resort. I pulled out my smartphone and synchronized the device. I looked directly at Mr. Volkov, telling him that forged land deeds were only a fraction of the criminal conspiracy his prospective business partner had orchestrated to steal their $10 million. I pressed play on the first audio file. The pristine acoustics of the boardroom amplified the recording perfectly. It was a captured phone call between Blake and the hired mercenary Dr. Aris. Blake's voice was frantic and demanding, explicitly instructing the fake physician to diagnose me with severe cognitive decline in exchange for a $10,000 cash bribe. Blake was recorded laughing cruelly, assuring the fake doctor that my family would funnel the payment from my stolen retirement accounts and that the municipal judge was already bought off. The foreign billionaires listened to the undeniable proof of medical extortion and elder abuse, their expressions darkening with every vile word my son-in-law spoke. Before Blake could even attempt to shout over the speaker, I triggered the next file. This time, I routed the video feed directly to the massive digital screen behind Blake, overriding his glossy resort presentation. The high-definition footage lit up the room. It was the security footage from the coastal garage the night of the raid. DeAndre was pinned in the sand, handcuffed, surrounded by police. In a moment of absolute desperate panic, DeAndre was recorded screaming at the arresting officers, begging for a deal. He explicitly confessed on tape that Blake had engineered the entire demolition permit using a forged signature. DeAndre frantically admitted that Blake was running a massive Ponzi scheme, bleeding dry local shadow lenders and using the forged coastal deed as fraudulent collateral to secure international funding. DeAndre threw Blake completely under the bus, detailing how his brother-in-law orchestrated the entire land grab to save himself from violent creditors. The video played in staggering clarity, the audio echoing off the boardroom walls, completely dismantling every shred of Blake's professional and personal credibility. I paused the video, leaving the frozen image of a handcuffed, confessing DeAndre towering over Blake's head. I picked up my smartphone and looked around the obsidian table. I informed the billionaires that they were not investing in a lucrative coastal resort. They were about to wire $10 million directly into a collapsing criminal enterprise operated by a desperate, cornered thief. The silence that followed the presentation was absolute and suffocating. The 3 foreign billionaires sat perfectly rigid, their faces turning to solid stone. They were men who had built international empires, surviving ruthless corporate wars, and they did not tolerate being treated like foolish marks in a cheap suburban hustle. Mr. Volkov slowly pushed the silver pen away from the disbursement contract. He closed the thick legal binder Oliver had provided, resting his hands heavily on top of it. He looked at Blake not with anger, but with the cold, detached disgust reserved for a cockroach that had wandered onto a pristine dining table. They realized with absolute clarity that Blake had systematically lied to them for months, attempting to siphon $10 million of their capital to cover his lethal personal debts. Blake realized the guillotine was dropping. He lunged forward, slamming his hands onto the obsidian table, his immaculate suit now drenched in a cold, panicked sweat. He began to stammer uncontrollably, desperately trying to spin a counter-narrative. He shouted that the audio recordings were manipulated, created by artificial intelligence, and illegally obtained by a vengeful old man. He pointed wildly at me, shrieking that I was a hostile saboteur trying to ruin his legitimate business. He begged Mr. Volkov to ignore the disruption, promising that he had other municipal judges ready to override the blind trust by the end of the week. He promised them doubled profit margins, pleading for the capital transfer to go through immediately. His voice cracked, losing all of its polished corporate authority, devolving into the pathetic, shrill begging of a cornered animal facing total ruin. The investors did not even blink at his frantic performance. Mr. Volkov stood up smoothly, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. The other two investors followed his lead in perfect unison. Without speaking a single word to Blake, they simultaneously snapped their heavy leather briefcases shut. The sharp, synchronized clicking of the brass locks echoed like gunshots in the tense room, signaling the absolute death of Blake Financial Empire. Blake fell to his knees, clutching the edge of the obsidian table, sobbing as his $10 million salvation vanished before his eyes. At that exact moment, the heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom swung open one final time. I stepped back, allowing the new arrivals to enter the room. Two tall men in dark windbreakers walked in, their faces grim and authoritative. They simultaneously reached to their belts, pulling out leather wallets and flashing golden federal badges. The lead agent looked directly at the weeping man on the floor. The lead agent stepped fully into the boardroom, his golden badge gleaming under the recessed lighting. He did not raise his voice, but his command sliced through the tense air like a scalpel. He addressed Blake directly, stating he was under federal arrest for wire fraud, document forgery, and conspiracy to commit interstate financial crimes. Blake physically recoiled, stammering a chaotic string of denials, but the second agent had already moved behind him. The sharp, metallic ratcheting of steel handcuffs echoing in the pristine corporate suite finalized Blake's total destruction. He was violently forced to place his hands behind his back, his expensive tailored suit bunching up awkwardly as the cold metal locked around his wrists. Mr. Volkov and the other two foreign billionaires watched the execution of justice with absolute unflinching apathy. They did not utter a single word in his defense. They simply gathered their briefcases, stepped around the handcuffed man as if he were a discarded piece of trash, and exited the room. Blake frantically called out to them, promising that it was a massive misunderstanding and begging them not to withdraw their capital, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. His multi-million-dollar empire had officially evaporated. Oliver Stanton stood beside me, his arms crossed, watching the federal agents recite the Miranda rights to the broken, hyperventilating developer. I did not smile. I simply buttoned my suit jacket and followed the agents as they hauled my son-in-law out of the executive suite, marching him toward the glass elevators to face his public humiliation. This was the man who had confidently looked me in the eye at my wife's funeral and demanded I hand over my legacy. Now he was nothing more than a federally indicted criminal being marched past his own stunned employees. Every receptionist, analyst, and junior partner in the firm stopped working to stare as their invincible chief executive was paraded through the corridors in steel restraints. The elevator doors opened onto the expansive marble lobby of the corporate headquarters. Standing near the towering glass entrance, clutching her designer handbag tightly against her chest, was Kendra. She had clearly received an automated alert about the police presence or had come to demand answers from her husband regarding his collapsing scheme. When she saw the federal agents dragging Blake toward the revolving doors, her face drained of all color. Blake spotted her instantly. His eyes widened with a sudden, desperate surge of hope. He dug his heels into the polished marble, forcing the agents to momentarily halt their march, and called out to his wife. His voice was shrill, completely stripped of its usual manipulative charm. He begged Kendra to immediately call his senior defense attorney. He ordered her to liquidate her personal trust fund, sell her jewelry, and post whatever exorbitant bail the federal judge was about to set. He frantically spun a lie right there in the lobby, claiming he had been framed by his corrupt business partners and that he needed her absolute loyalty to survive the indictment. I stood a few feet away watching my daughter closely. Just 48 hours ago, she had stood in my living room screaming that I was a heartless monster for refusing to save this man. She had actively tried to record me intending to assist him in locking me inside a psychiatric ward. Now she was staring directly at the reality of the man she had married. She looked at his panicked, sweating face, then down at the heavy steel cuffs binding his wrists. She slowly stepped forward. Blake leaned in, anticipating a frantic promise of devotion. Instead, Kendra reached down to her left hand. With a steady, deliberate motion, she slid the massive 3-carat diamond engagement ring and her platinum wedding band off her finger. She did not shed a single tear. She did not scream or hurl insults. She simply extended her hand and dropped the heavy rings directly into Blake's handcuffed palms. The jewelry hit the steel chains with a sharp final clink. She told him that she was filing for divorce before he even reached a holding cell. Blake gasped, entirely shattered by the absolute rejection. Kendra turned her back on him, walking out the glass doors into the crisp morning air without casting a single glance in my direction. The agent shoved Blake forward, hauling the weeping, broken man out to the waiting armored transport. While Blake was being processed in a federal holding facility, the shockwaves of our tactical strike were detonating across the city. Oliver received a real-time alert from his forensic accounting team tracking the frozen assets. Heather had not stayed at the hospital after recovering from her accidental self-poisoning. Realizing DeAndre had been arrested at the coastal compound and that Blake's corporate network was imploding, she immediately executed her exit strategy. She drove her luxury sedan straight to her primary banking branch, carrying a massive designer travel bag. Her plan was entirely predictable. She intended to liquidate every remaining cent from their joint checking accounts, drain her personal credit lines, and flee the state before the federal conspiracy charges expanded to include her. She marched up to the teller with her platinum debit card, demanding a cashier's check for her entire balance and an immediate cash withdrawal of $20,000. The teller swiped this card, paused, and swiped it again. A bold red notification illuminated the screen. Heather scoffed angrily, demanding to see the branch manager throwing a massive tantrum about her elite client status. The manager stepped out of his office, completely unbothered by her screaming. He informed her that her platinum card, along with every single account tied to DeAndre and Blake's corporate holding firm, had been officially frozen by a federal mandate. The wire fraud investigation initiated by Oliver had triggered an automatic total asset freeze across all affiliated institutions. Heather demanded to use her secondary credit cards, frantic to access any liquid capital. The manager calmly stated that those lines of credit were entirely revoked, pending an ongoing investigation into identity theft and medical fraud. Heather was completely cut off. Panic fully overtook her. Relying on the last few $100s of cash she had hidden in her purse, Heather managed to secure a taxi ride to the international airport. She dragged her heavy, oversized luggage through the bustling terminal, frantically searching for an available flight out of the country. She approached the ticketing counter, slapping down her passport and demanding a seat on the next departing flight to anywhere. The ticketing agent requested a valid form of payment. Heather cycled through 6 different premium credit cards, watching in absolute terror as the machine violently rejected every single one. Her phone began to ring relentlessly. The caller ID flashed between aggressive collection agencies and DeAndre's desperate, unpaid public defender. Heather stood completely paralyzed in the middle of the crowded airport. She was utterly stranded, possessing absolutely nothing but a heavy suitcase entirely filled with useless designer clothes. DeAndre walked out of the federal holding facility 72 hours later. A low-level public defender had managed to secure his bail, but my son walked out of those heavy steel doors completely stripped of his arrogant swagger. His expensive suit was wrinkled and stained with coastal dirt, a pathetic reminder of his failed assault. He did not have a luxury car waiting for him at the curb. He did not have a driver, and he certainly did not have Heather. He walked 2 miles to a bus stop, clutching a plastic bag containing his wallet and dead cell phone. When he finally arrived at his pristine suburban neighborhood, the illusion of his success was entirely shattered. An aggressive neon orange foreclosure notice was plastered across his heavy mahogany front door. He used his key, pushing past the warning, expecting to find Heather frantically packing. Instead, he walked into a completely barren house. The luxury furniture, the expensive artwork, the designer rugs, everything of liquid value was gone. Heather had gutted the house with ruthless efficiency. She had abandoned him completely, leaving nothing but an empty echo in the cavernous rooms. DeAndre pulled his phone from the plastic bag and plugged it into a wall outlet, desperate to check his remaining accounts. When the screen flared to life, his banking app confirmed the absolute devastation. The accounts were not just frozen, they were entirely depleted of whatever meager funds Heather had managed to siphon before the federal mandate hit. He was totally and utterly bankrupt, facing severe felony charges without a single dollar to hire a defense attorney to keep him out of federal prison. The desperation broke him completely. DeAndre had operated his entire adult life under the arrogant assumption that he could manipulate, steal, and bully his way into wealth. Now stripped of his money, his wife, and his power, he reverted to his final pathetic safety net. He walked 5 miles across the city, his expensive leather shoes blistering his feet, heading straight toward the very man he had tried to drug and commit to an asylum just a few nights ago. I was sitting in my living room reading a novel when the front doorbell rang. I did not need to check the security cameras to know who was standing on my porch. I opened the heavy oak door and looked down at my son. DeAndre fell to his knees on the concrete, absolutely broken. He did not try to project authority or spin a manipulative narrative. He wept, real pathetic tears streaming down his face. He grabbed the fabric of my trousers, begging for forgiveness. He sobbed that he was terrified of going to federal prison, that Blake had tricked him into the massive loan, and that Heather had taken everything he had left. He pleaded with me, crying out that he was my only son and that I could not possibly abandon my own flesh and blood to the ruthless federal justice system. He begged me to unfreeze a fraction of Sylvia estate, just enough to hire a competent defense attorney to secure a plea deal. He swore that if I saved him this one final time, he would dedicate the rest of his life to making amends. I looked down at the weeping man on my porch, feeling absolutely zero empathy. I did not see my son. I saw the predator who had handed his wife a cup of heavily sedated coffee, intending to drug his own father into submission. I saw the man who had hired armed thugs to violently evict a teenager he had thrown away 15 years ago. I did not raise my voice, nor did I offer a single word of comfort. I reached into the inner pocket of my trousers and pulled out my leather money clip. I extracted a single crisp $100 bill. I held it up, making sure DeAndre saw the green paper clearly. His crying slowed a sudden, pathetic spark of hope lighting up his bloodshot eyes. He thought I was reaching for my checkbook. He thought the $100 was a down payment on his salvation. I looked him dead in the eyes, ensuring my voice carried the absolute unyielding finality of a judge delivering a death sentence. I let go of the crisp bill, watching it flutter down and land gently in the dirt right next to DeAndre, kneeling legs. "This is exactly what you valued your mother life at," I stated, my voice completely stripped of any paternal warmth. "You traded her legacy and my sanity for the illusion of power. Pick it up and buy yourself a bus ticket to the public defender office. Don't ever call me Dad again." I stepped back inside my home and closed the heavy oak door, the brass tumblers clicking shut with absolute finality. The federal justice system moves with a slow but absolutely crushing weight. Over the next 6 months, the remnants of my former family were systematically eradicated from high society. Blake did not secure a lenient plea deal. The foreign billionaires he attempted to defraud deployed their own armada of corporate lawyers to ensure the maximum penalty. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and conspiracy. There would be no early parole. DeAndre fared no better. Stripped of his wealth and abandoned by his wife, he sat in court with a public defender who barely looked at him. The evidence we provided was impenetrable. DeAndre was handed a 5-year sentence for his role in the forgery and the attempted medical extortion. He traded his tailored suits for an orange jumpsuit entirely destroyed by his own blind ambition. Heather avoided prison time by turning state evidence against Blake and DeAndre at the 11th hour, but she did not escape financial ruin. The federal mandate seized every single asset she owned. The court ordered her to pay massive financial restitution to the victims of Blake's collapsing Ponzi scheme. The woman who once complained about the humidity ruining her designer hair at my wife's funeral was now working a grueling minimum wage shift at a suburban strip mall diner. She spent her days scrubbing grease off industrial griddles, her wages aggressively garnished by federal tax collectors before she even saw a single paycheck. Their arrogant empire of lies was completely reduced to ash. I did not attend their sentencing hearings. I did not read the pathetic letters they attempted to send me from their respective holding cells. I had already closed that door. With the toxic rot completely excised from my life, I packed a small travel bag and drove back out to the coast. The highway felt entirely different this time. The crushing, suffocating weight of grief and betrayal that had anchored me to the driver's seat just weeks ago was completely gone. I drove with the windows rolled down, letting the sharp, salty ocean air fill the cabin of my sedan. I was not driving toward a battleground anymore. I was driving home. I pulled onto the familiar dirt road and stopped exactly 10 feet from the massive oxidized iron gates that had successfully shielded my wife's secret empire for nearly 4 decades. Tevin was already waiting for me on the other side. He wore his heavy canvas mechanic overalls, holding a pair of heavy-duty angle grinders and an industrial blowtorch. The threat of bulldozers and armed thugs was permanently eradicated. We did not need to hide behind a facade of decay any longer. I stepped out of my car, took off my suit jacket, and rolled up my sleeves. I grabbed a heavy steel crowbar from the back of Tevin's truck. We did not speak a word. We simply walked up to the towering, rusted metal and went to work. Tevin fired up the blowtorch, applying the searing blue flame directly to the corroded iron hinges that Sylvia had deliberately allowed to rust. Sparks showered across the coastal dirt as the thick metal finally warped and surrendered. I wedged the crowbar deep into the failing joints, putting the entire weight of my body into the leverage. The iron groaned a loud metallic screech, protesting the movement before the top hinge completely snapped. We pushed together, shoving the heavy barricade outward. The massive gates crashed violently into the sand, kicking up a thick cloud of dust. With the visual barrier destroyed, a powerful, unimpeded gust of coastal wind swept directly into the compound. It carried the fresh, clean scent of the ocean right through the glass bay doors of the restoration garage. The fortress was open. The deceit was over. I wiped the sweat from my forehead, looking at my grandson. He smiled a genuine, unburdened expression that mirrored the absolute freedom I felt in my own chest. We walked past the fallen gates and entered the pristine, climate-controlled garage. Tevin wiped his grease-stained hands on a shop towel and gestured for me to follow him into the back office. The heavy ledgers and legal binders that we used to dismantle Blake fraud were neatly stacked on the drafting table. Tevin bypassed the safe and reached behind a framed photograph of a vintage Shelby Cobra hanging on the wall. He retrieved a small sealed envelope made of thick parchment paper. He held it out to me, his expression turning solemn and profoundly respectful. He explained that Sylvia had given him 2 envelopes before she passed away. The first was the thick manila folder containing the financial ledgers and the blind trust documents we had already deployed. But she gave him strict, unwavering instructions regarding this second, smaller envelope. Tevin was ordered to keep it entirely hidden until the war was officially over. He was only permitted to hand it to me after the threats were neutralized, the gates were opened, and the estate was permanently secured. I took the envelope from his hands. My name was written across the front in Sylvia Immaculate Elegant cursive. My chest tightened, a sudden surge of pure emotion breaking through the cold, calculated armor I had worn for the past month. I slid my thumb under the wax seal and carefully opened the flap. Inside was a single piece of heavy stationery folded perfectly in half. It was a handwritten letter from the woman who had masterminded the survival of our family from the shadows. I unfolded the paper, recognizing the familiar blue ink she always used for important documents. I smoothed out the heavy paper on the glass desk and read my wife final words. She did not write about the cars, the land, or the money. Sylvia wrote directly to the core of my soul. "My dearest Alton," she began, "I never wanted to burden you with this secret, but I knew the exact moment I was gone the vultures would circle. I knew DeAndre and Heather greed would rapidly consume them. I knew they would try to strip you of everything and discard you. I built this coastal fortress to protect Tevin from their poison, but I left the legal triggers in your hands for a reason. I knew their greed would consume them. I just needed you to be the one to guide Tevin when they finally fell. You are the only man strong enough to burn their lies to the ground and rebuild this family true legacy." I folded Sylvia's letter and placed it safely inside the breast pocket of my shirt, right next to my heart. I stepped out of the glass office and walked toward the massive open bay doors where the rusted iron gates used to stand. The coastal breeze carried the sharp tang of salt and sea spray washing over my face. For 36 years, I had stubbornly refused to make the drive down this highway. I had convinced myself that the ocean was merely a distraction from my demanding engineering career, and that the old wooden shack we bought decades ago was nothing but a sentimental liability. I had allowed my rigid pursuit of a pristine suburban life to blind me to what was truly valuable. Sylvia never lost her vision. She knew that concrete and bank accounts could easily be stolen or corrupted by the very children we raised. While I spent my life building a fragile illusion of a perfect family in the city, My wife was out here on the coast, building a heavily fortified sanctuary. I looked back over my shoulder at Tevin. He was carefully putting away his welding tools, wiping his hands on a clean shop rag with the exact same meticulous discipline I applied to my aerospace blueprints. The sprawling 50-acre compound, the high-tech security, the millions of dollars in coastal equity, all of it was ultimately just dirt and steel. The true inheritance Sylvia left behind was not a financial empire. It was the grandson I never knew I had. She had salvaged my bloodline from the wreckage of DeAndre arrogance and handed me a worthy heir. Tevin tossed the shop rag onto his workbench and gestured for me to follow him to the far corner of the immaculate garage. Tucked beneath a heavy canvas drop cloth sat a vehicle that had been meticulously isolated from the rest of the classic inventory. Tevin grabbed the edge of the heavy fabric and pulled it back in one smooth, sweeping motion. The fluorescent garage lights cascaded over the flawless, pristine curves of a vintage 1969 Ford Mustang. It was painted in an immaculate gloss midnight blue, exactly the same shade as the car Sylvia and I had driven down the California coastline on our honeymoon almost half a century ago. Tevin walked around to the driver's side, opening the door to reveal a completely restored black leather interior. He explained that Sylvia had tracked down the exact make and model 15 years ago. She had funded the acquisition, but she made Tevin perform every single hour of the mechanical restoration himself. She wanted him to understand the value of taking something broken and completely rebuilding it from the ground up. He slid into the driver's seat and inserted a gleaming silver key into the ignition. He looked at me through the open window, offering a proud, confident smile. He turned the key and engaged the starter. The massive 8-cylinder engine roared to life with a violent, deafening mechanical explosion. It was not the quiet hum of a modern luxury sedan. It was the raw, aggressive thunder of pure American muscle, perfectly tuned and begging to be unleashed. The sheer acoustic force of the exhaust reverberated off the reinforced concrete walls, rattling the tools on the workbenches and vibrating deep within my chest. I closed my eyes and let the magnificent mechanical roar wash over me. It sounded exactly like the summer of 1974. It was the sound of my youth, of my honeymoon, of a time before greed and betrayal had infected my family tree. The roar of the engine was absolutely perfect. It was a mechanical symphony of survival and rebirth, engineered by a discarded grandson and funded by a brilliant visionary wife. Tevin revved the engine, sending a shockwave of power out toward the open ocean. The deafening roar of the Mustang engine drowned out every lingering echo of the past month. I opened my eyes and looked at the immaculate vehicle, knowing that the toxic branches of my family tree had been permanently and completely severed. DeAndre was sitting in a federal holding cell, utterly destroyed by the weight of his own criminal ambition. Heather was trapped in a minimum wage nightmare, stripped of the luxury and status she had worshipped above all else. Blake was facing over a decade behind bars, his massive corporate fraud completely exposed to the world. Kendra had walked away from the wreckage, choosing to save herself, but permanently exiling herself from my life and my estate. The aggressive emotional blackmail, the forged documents, the fake medical evaluations, and the midnight poisonings had all failed. I had not just survived their coordinated attack, I had completely annihilated their futures using nothing but patience, logic, and the legal weaponry my wife had left behind. My wealth was completely secure, locked within an impenetrable trust that no greedy relative or corrupt judge could ever breach. My dignity remained entirely intact, untouched by their desperate attempts to brand me as a frail, demented old fool. I had walked through the fire of their ultimate betrayal and emerged completely unscathed. I looked at Tevin as he cut the engine, letting the powerful machine settle into a low, steady idle. I finally had an heir who understood the value of hard work, loyalty, and genuine respect. I walked out of the garage and stepped onto the soft coastal sand. I unfolded a sturdy wooden chair that Sylvia used to sit in and placed it directly facing the crashing waves of the ocean. I poured myself a fresh cup of dark roast coffee from my steel thermos. The ocean breeze blew past me, completely unobstructed by the rusted iron gates that had finally been torn down. I leaned back in the chair, feeling the warm morning sun on my face. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, letting the rich, bitter taste ground me in the present moment. I listened to the rhythmic crashing of the waves against the shore. For the first time in my entire life, the absolute silence around me did not feel like a heavy, crushing burden. It felt exactly like victory. As I sat there watching the ocean, a profound realization settled over me, sharp and undeniable. For 40 years, I approached fatherhood with the exact same mentality I applied to my mechanical engineering contracts. I mistakenly believed that if I provided enough structural support, if I infused enough financial capital into the foundation, the machine would simply function as intended. I thought writing checks for DeAndre was a paternal duty. I thought funding his expensive college tuition, paying for his lavish wedding, and bailing out his early business failures were acts of unconditional love. I was completely wrong. In aerospace engineering, if you reinforce a fundamentally flawed piece of metal with expensive titanium brackets, you do not fix the inherent weakness. You merely delay the inevitable catastrophic failure. The underlying rot continues to spread hidden beneath a polished, expensive surface until the entire structure violently shatters under pressure. I spent my entire adult life reinforcing a fundamentally broken man. I mistook my financial enablement for good parenting. I allowed my son to bypass the essential, painful process of building his own character. I shielded him from the natural consequences of his arrogance, assuming my money would fix him in time. That is the true tragedy of giving everything to people who have earned absolutely nothing. They do not view your generosity as a profound sacrifice. They view your wealth as their birthright. When you remove the struggle from a human development, you systematically destroy their capacity for empathy. DeAndre did not see me as a grieving widower standing over Sylvia's freshly dug grave. He saw an administrative hurdle blocking his access to unearned capital. He viewed my physical existence as a tedious delay in his financial timeline. By constantly saving him from the brink of ruin over the decades, I actively trained him to become a predator. I taught him that his mistakes would always be subsidized by my sweat. I constructed the very monster that eventually tried to lock me inside a psychiatric ward. Sylvia understood this dark reality long before I ever did. She realized that true love sometimes requires an iron fist and absolute refusal. She recognized that handing a fortune to a morally bankrupt son would not just ruin his life, but it would actively fund his capacity to destroy others. Her silence towards me was not a betrayal. It was just pure, cold, tactical brilliance. If there is a fundamental truth to be extracted from the wreckage of my family, it is this: you cannot buy loyalty, and you certainly cannot purchase respect. Respect is forged in the fires of accountability. When you become an endless well of resources for someone who refuses to work, you stop being a parent or a mentor. You simply become a target. I had to learn to sever the infected branch so the rest of the tree could survive. It was the most brutal, excruciating decision of my entire life, but it was the only way to protect Tevin and honor Sylvia and her invisible sacrifices. Tevin is a young man who knows the visceral ache of abandonment and the harsh reality of earning every single meal with grease-stained hands. Because he understands the absolute bottom, he possesses the character required to handle the top. He will manage this $30 million estate with the exact same humility and discipline he used to rebuild that classic Mustang. He knows that true power is not found in luxury suits or foreign bank accounts, but in the unwavering quiet strength of keeping your word and standing your ground against predators. If there is someone in your life who constantly drains your energy, manipulates your love for financial gain, or treats you like an endless resource rather than a human being, you must stop funding your own destruction today. Do not wait for them to push you off a cliff or lock you inside a room to take what is yours. Draw a hard, uncompromising line in the sand. Let them face the absolute consequences of their own choices. True family will respect your boundaries and build alongside you, while predators will only rage because they can no longer exploit your generosity. I chose to protect my peace, and in doing so, I secured my legacy forever. Now I want to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to cut off a toxic family member who mistook your kindness for weakness? How did you finally find the strength to walk away from their manipulation? Share your personal stories and experiences in the comments section below right now. If you found value in my journey, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more stories. Remember, your peace is priceless. Do not ever sell it out.